It began not as a division, not as a regiment, but as a reaction, a formation pulled together in urgency, shaped by necessity, and driven forward by a collapsing timetable. Kampfgruppe Knittel did not exist on paper long before it existed on frozen roads. It was assembled quickly during the Ardennes Offensive, drawn from reconnaissance units, armored elements, and fragments of formations already committed to a gamble that demanded speed above all else. Its purpose was simple and unforgiving: move fast, exploit openings, and push west before resistance could harden. But war rarely rewards improvisation for long. By the time Kampfgruppe Knittel entered the frozen landscape of the Ardennes, the offensive was already under strain. Fuel was scarce, roads were congested, orders arrived layered with urgency and contradiction. The grand plan still existed in headquarters, but on the ground, reality was narrowing fast. Kampfgruppe Knittel was meant to be eyes in reach, a fast-moving force that could probe ahead, secure crossings, and keep momentum alive. Reconnaissance units were ideal for this role in theory. They were trained for speed, flexibility, and independent action. In practice, those strengths were tested against terrain, weather, and an enemy that was no longer surprised. The Ardennes in winter was not kind to speed. Snow-covered roads and fields alike, hiding ditches, mines, and wreckage. Forests closed in on narrow routes, limiting maneuver and visibility. Fog settled into valleys and refused to lift. Engines strained in cold that thickened fuel and froze metal. Every mile forward demanded effort that plans had not accounted for. As Kampfgruppe Knittel advanced, it encountered resistance that was uneven but stubborn. American units, shaken but not broken, began to regroup. Roadblocks appeared. Bridges were defended or destroyed. Artillery fire found narrow columns with increasing accuracy. What had been intended as swift movement became cautious progress. The fight around places like Stavelot and nearby crossings exposed the limits of the Kampfgruppe's role. Reconnaissance vehicles were not designed to force defended positions. Light armor could not withstand sustained fire. Infantry support was often limited or delayed. The very speed that defined the unit now worked against it, pushing it into situations where holding ground became as important as advancing, a task it was never meant to perform. Kampfgruppe Knittel became entangled. Columns stalled. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel. Routes that seemed open on maps proved impassable under fire. American counterattacks increased in coordination and strength. Artillery blanketed approaches. Air power loomed whenever weather allowed. The window for exploitation narrowed until it was little more than a slit. The Kampfgruppe fought on regardless. It adapted where it could, pulled back when necessary, pressed forward when opportunity appeared, even briefly. But the larger tide had already turned. The Ardennes offensive was losing momentum everywhere, not just here. Fuel shortages became crippling. Communications faltered. Units that had advanced too far found themselves exposed and isolated. For Kampfgruppe Knittel, survival replaced ambition. The retreat was as dangerous as the advance had been hopeful. Roads were watched. Bridges were threatened. Every movement risked encirclement. Vehicles that could not move were destroyed or left behind. Men became separated from units, units from command. The Kampfgruppe dissolved gradually, not through a single decisive blow, but through exhaustion, attrition, and inevitability. Its story is not one of dramatic breakthrough or final stand. It is a story of the middle ground of war, where plans meet friction, where improvisation collides with logistics, and where speed alone cannot overcome geography and resistance. Kampfgruppe Knittel represents the reality of late-war German operations. Formations assembled quickly, tasked with impossible objectives and consumed by conditions they could not control. Understanding its history helps explain why the Ardennes offensive failed, not just at the strategic level, but at the tactical one. It failed because small units like this were asked to do too much with too little, too late. Tonight, we return to that story, to the frozen roads where reconnaissance became combat, to the crossings that promised movement and delivered delay, to a formation built for speed, slowed by reality, to Kampfgruppe Knittel, a name that captures urgency, improvisation, and the limits of momentum. Before we continue, I want to bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has settled around you there? Is it late and quiet, or is the day just beginning to fade? If these deep dives into overlooked units help you appreciate how history is shaped by small formations, making hard choices under pressure, consider subscribing, not for big headlines, but for the stories in between, the ones that reveal how wars actually move, slow, and end. Take a breath. This story unfolds quietly, but it matters. December the 17th, 1944, 2:15 in the afternoon. In a snow-covered field at the Bonnier crossroads near Malmedy, Belgium, 84 American prisoners of war lay dead or dying in the freezing mud. The massacre had ended minutes earlier, the crack of pistol shots still echoing across the white landscape. Then, through the winter silence, came a new sound, the grinding rumble of tracked vehicles approaching from the south. Survivors, pretending to be corpses, heard German voices shouting commands. But these weren't the same voices, the same units that had just murdered their comrades. This was someone else entirely. A ghost column that would haunt the historical record for the next 80 years. The men hiding among the bodies heard the vehicles slow, then accelerate again, continuing northward towards Stavelot. When American intelligence officers in the nearby town of Spa began receiving reports that evening, they faced a puzzle that made no tactical sense. Two separate SS armored columns operating in the same narrow corridor within hours of each other. The first column, later identified as Kampfgruppe Piper, had clearly committed the atrocity. But the second column, this mystery unit spotted by multiple witnesses, appeared nowhere on Allied intelligence maps. No designation, no commander name, no order of battle, just scattered reports of armored cars and half-tracks bearing SS insignia, moving fast through the gathering darkness. American analysts worked through the night, trying to piece together which German units were where, but the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. For 3 days, this unidentified battle group seemed to materialize and vanish like smoke. A reconnaissance patrol reported SS vehicles at Stavelot. An hour later, infantry advancing on the same position found it empty. Radio intercepts picked up German communications referencing a Knittel, but couldn't determine if this was a unit, a commander, or a code name. Belgian civilians emerging from cellars described German soldiers in camouflage smocks asking directions to bridges, then disappearing before American reinforcements arrived. The Allied intelligence map of December 17th through 19th became a confusion of arrows, question marks, and contradictory sighting reports. Somewhere in the chaos of the Ardennes Offensive, an entire Kampfgruppe had slipped through the net. The truth would only emerge much later, in the interrogation rooms of 1946. Gustav Knittel sat across from American war crimes investigators, a gaunt figure in a prisoner's uniform, and began to tell his version of those 72 hours. He was 29 years old during the battle, an SS Sturmbannführer, equivalent to a major. He commanded the reconnaissance battalion of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. His unit, he explained carefully, had arrived at the Bonnier crossroads approximately 30 to 45 minutes after the massacre. His men saw bodies in the field. They reported it to him. He ordered them to keep moving toward their objective. The bridges were more important than investigating American casualties. That was his story, delivered in flat, unemotional German. But the investigators weren't satisfied. Survivor testimony painted a different picture. American soldiers who'd played dead described hearing a second group of vehicles arrive, hearing different voices, hearing what sounded like additional shots. Physical evidence at the scene included shell casings from weapons used by reconnaissance units, not just the types carried by Piper's tank crews. And there was the matter of timing. Multiple witnesses placed German vehicles at the crossroads well past 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The massacre had officially ended by 2:45. That left a window of 15 to 30 minutes unaccounted for. A window where someone, some German unit, had been present at a war crime scene and done absolutely nothing. Kampfgruppe Knittel became central to the largest war crimes trial in the European theater. Not because prosecutors believed they'd pulled the triggers, but because they needed to understand what came after. In the fog of war, in the chaos of the Ardennes, an entire armored battle group had witnessed the aftermath of mass murder and simply driven past. The legal questions multiplied. What exactly had Knittel's scouts seen? How detailed were their reports? Did Knittel issue any orders regarding the bodies, the survivors, the scene? And crucially, why had he decided, in that moment, that his mission took precedence over rendering aid, documenting evidence, or even basic human decency? The ghost column had a name now. SS Panzeraufklärungsabteilung 1, the 1st SS Reconnaissance Battalion. Approximately 1,000 men, a mixture of armored cars, half-tracks, and attached tanks. Veteran soldiers who'd spent 3 years on the Eastern Front before arriving in Belgium. They weren't fresh recruits or fanatics stumbling through their first battle. These were professionals, skilled reconnaissance troops trained to operate independently, to make command decisions far from supervision, to exploit opportunities and avoid entanglements. Which made their actions at Malmedy even more chilling. They'd seen the massacre site and performed a cold calculation. This wasn't their problem, and stopping would jeopardize their mission. Modern historians examining the archives still argue about the precise timeline. Some maintain Knittel's lead elements arrived as early as 2:30, potentially witnessing the massacre itself. Others accept his version that they came later, seeing only the grim aftermath. The physical evidence supports both interpretations depending on which forensic analysis you trust. The German military records that might have resolved the question were destroyed in the final months of the war. All that remains are testimonies given under duress, memories filtered through trauma and self-preservation, and the stubborn fact that over 80 men died in that field while German soldiers, multiple groups of German soldiers, passed within meters of their bodies. What transforms Kampfgruppe Knittel from a footnote into a compelling story is this collision of tactical efficiency and moral bankruptcy. They would go on to fight brilliantly for the next 4 days, seizing bridges against superior forces, holding positions that should have been impossible to defend, demonstrating the kind of aggressive initiative that military academies still study. Their commander would earn praise even from American after-action reports for his skillful maneuvering. But it all began with that moment at Bonnier Crossroads, with the decision to keep driving, to prioritize operational objectives over human lives. The ghost column had always been there, moving through the Ardennes. They just didn't want to be seen. The investigation files from 1945 and 46 contain thousands of pages, but one interrogation transcript stands out. An American officer asked Knittel directly, "What did you feel when your men reported bodies in the field?" His answer, translated from German, was chilling in its simplicity. "I felt that we were losing time, not horror, not shock, not even military concern about enemy actions, just impatience at a delay." That single sentence captures something essential about Kampfgruppe Knittel and the unit it belonged to. They were men who'd learned on the brutal Eastern Front that sentiment was a luxury, that missions mattered more than morality, that victory justified everything. When they arrived in Belgium in December 1944, they brought those lessons with them. The ghost column wasn't invisible. It was just operating by rules the rest of the world had tried to forget. June 22, 1941, 4 in the morning, the German-Soviet border near Brest-Litovsk erupted in artillery fire as 3 million men surged eastward in Operation Barbarossa. Among them, commanding a reconnaissance platoon in Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was a 26-year-old SS Obersturmführer named Gustav Knittel. His unit crossed the Bug River on improvised bridges, moving fast ahead of the main armored columns. Their mission was straightforward in theory: penetrate deep into Soviet territory, identify enemy positions, report back, survive. In practice, on the Eastern Front, survival was never straightforward. Knittel would spend the next 3.5 years learning exactly what that meant. The reconnaissance troops weren't the parade ground soldiers of newsreels and propaganda posters. They were motorcycle riders, armored car crews, men who lived in the gap between the front lines and the rear. Their vehicles were open-topped, offering speed but almost no protection. When they encountered Soviet forces, They couldn't stand and fight like infantry or tanks. They had to shoot, assess, and vanish. Knittel proved exceptionally good at this lethal game of tag. By November 1941, during the first desperate winter battles near Rostov, his aggressive tactics caught the attention of senior commanders. He'd led a night reconnaissance that identified a gap in Soviet lines, enabling Leibstandarte to escape encirclement. The division commander personally promoted him on the battlefield. But the Eastern Front wasn't just about tactical brilliance. It was about moral degradation on an industrial scale. Leibstandarte operated in the rear areas of Army Group South during the summer and fall of 1941, the period of the worst Einsatzgruppen massacres. There's no evidence Knittel's reconnaissance units participated directly in the murder of Jewish civilians and Soviet prisoners, but they operated in the same territory, used the same roads, bivouacked in the same towns. They saw the mass graves, they heard the shots, they knew. And like tens of thousands of Wehrmacht and SS soldiers, they kept doing their jobs, kept following orders, kept pretending that the industrial-scale murder happening around them was someone else's responsibility. 1943 brought Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. SS Panzeraufklärungsabteilung 1, now expanded to battalion strength, operated as the forward screening force for Leibstandarte's assault divisions. Knittel commanded 2nd Company, equipped with the newer SDKFZ 234 armored cars, 8-wheeled vehicles mounting 20mm cannon. His mission was to race ahead of the Panther and Tiger tanks, find the Soviet defensive belts, identify the killing zones. It was reconnaissance as sacrifice. His company lost 30% of its vehicles in the first 2 days, but they provided the intelligence that allowed Leibstandarte to concentrate its armor at weak points, to achieve local breakthroughs even as the broader offensive collapsed. The winter of 1943 to 44, Yanjiang witnessed the slow German retreat across Ukraine. Knittel's finest hour came during the Korsun pocket operation in January and February 1944. Soviet forces had encircled 6 German divisions, over 50,000 men, in the frozen wasteland near the Dnieper River. Leibstandarte was ordered to break through and open an escape corridor. Knittel's reconnaissance battalion formed the point of the spear. For 3 days and nights, his companies fought through blizzards and Soviet tank ambushes, navigating by compass when visibility dropped to meters. They reached the encircled forces, established a narrow corridor, and held it open while 6 divisions retreated through the gap. Over 600 men escaped because Knittel's companies refused to break. His reward was promotion to major and command of the entire reconnaissance battalion. But every Eastern Front success came wrapped in atrocity. During the Korsun breakout, his troops participated in the murder of Soviet prisoners who couldn't keep pace with the retreat. During anti-partisan operations in Ukraine, reconnaissance units burned villages suspected of harboring guerrillas, making no distinction between combatants and civilians. These weren't aberrations or the actions of rogue soldiers. They were policy, implemented systematically, with the same efficiency Knittel applied to tactical operations. The man who could navigate by stars through a blizzard to save 600 Germans could also order a village burned without apparent moral conflict. The Eastern Front had taught him that total war meant total ruthlessness. By October 1944, Leibstandarte had been pulled back to Germany for rebuilding after near destruction in Normandy. The reconnaissance battalion that Knittel now commanded bore little resemblance to the motorcycle scouts of 1941. They were a mechanized force of nearly 1,000 men, equipped with the most modern armored cars in the Wehrmacht inventory, trained to operate as an independent Kampfgruppe when necessary. Their average age was 22. Half were veterans of the Eastern Front. The other half were recent conscripts from the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, retrained as reconnaissance troops. Knittel drove them through intensive exercises in the forests east of Cologne, rebuilding unit cohesion, testing new equipment, preparing for what everyone knew would be Germany's last offensive. The Eastern Front had given Knittel and his men a particular kind of combat education. They had learned to fight outnumbered and win through speed and violence of action. They had learned to scavenge fuel and ammunition from battlefields because supply lines were unreliable. They had learned to sleep in their vehicles, to eat when food appeared, to trust only their immediate comrades. and they'd learned that sentiment could get you killed. On the Eastern Front, stopping to bury the dead meant you might join them. Helping wounded enemies meant you might face their friends tomorrow. Following the rules of war meant fighting with one hand tied behind your back against an enemy who followed no rules at all. These lessons would prove catastrophic when applied in the very different context of the Ardennes. What kind of man had Gustav Knittel become by December 1944? The personnel file contains clues. Born 1915 in the Sudetenland, ethnic German territory in Czechoslovakia. Joined the SS in 1934 at age 19. Assigned to Leibstandartes Guard Company in Berlin. Early career as a ceremonial soldier. Standing watch at Nazi party rallies. First combat in Poland in 1939. Wounded 3 times on the Eastern Front, twice seriously. Awarded the Iron Cross First Class, the German Cross in Gold, the Close Combat Clasp. Married with 1 child. Described by superiors as aggressive, reliable, politically committed. That last phrase was SS code. It meant he was a true believer in National Socialism, not just a soldier following orders. The final piece of Knittel's Eastern Front education came in the form of operational independence. Reconnaissance battalions operated differently from line infantry or tank formations. They moved fast, often out of radio contact with higher command, forced to make critical decisions with incomplete information. Knittel had spent 3 years making those decisions. Which route to take, which objective to pursue, when to fight, and when to evade. He'd been right often enough to earn rapid promotion and his commander's trust. But that operational independence came with a dark side. It meant he'd also made moral decisions in isolation, without oversight, often without accountability. When his men committed atrocities in Ukraine or Russia, there was rarely anyone watching, rarely anyone to stop him. He'd learned that initiative was rewarded and questions were rare. That lesson would follow him to Belgium. September the 16th, 1944. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. General Alfred Jodl stood before a large map of Western Europe, watching Adolf Hitler's finger trace a path through the Ardennes forest. "Here," the Führer said, stabbing at the green terrain between the German border and the Meuse River. "We strike through here, split the British and Americans, retake Antwerp, force them to negotiate." The assembled generals exchanged glances. What Hitler was describing required forces Germany no longer possessed, fuel that didn't exist in sufficient quantities, and luck that had abandoned the Wehrmacht 2 years earlier. But no one spoke those truths aloud. The planning for Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had begun. The operation's architecture rested on several cascading assumptions, each more optimistic than the last. 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, would form the northern prong of the assault. Their mission? Smash through weak American defenses in the Ardennes, race 90 kilometers to the Meuse River crossings, seize the bridges before American engineers could destroy them, then continue northwest another 100 kilometers to Antwerp. Total distance, roughly 190 kilometers. Expected duration, 7 days maximum. Required. Complete surprise, good weather, roads that could handle armored columns, fuel from captured American depots, and an enemy that would collapse rather than fight. 5 enormous assumptions masquerading as a plan. Within 6th Panzer Army's order of battle, 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler held the crucial role as breakthrough force. The division would strike along multiple parallel routes, called roll-bonds, using overwhelming armor to puncture American lines. Following immediately behind Leibstandarte's lead elements would come the Reconnaissance Battalion, designated as Kampfgruppe Knittel for the operation. Knittel's mission was precisely defined on paper. Advance along Rollbahn D, the southernmost route, following 10 kilometers behind Kampfgruppe Piper. When Piper's column swung northwest toward Huy, Knittel would split northward, seize the bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts, then establish blocking positions to protect Leibstandarte's northern flank. Simple, elegant, completely divorced from reality. The planning documents reveal a staff drunk on operational fantasy. Knittel's Kampfgruppe would have to cover approximately 50 kilometers in the first 24 hours, fighting through or bypassing American positions, then seize intact bridges over the Amblève River. The bridges themselves were the first major problem. German intelligence relied on Belgian survey maps from 1938, updated with aerial reconnaissance photos taken in October 1944. The maps showed solid stone bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts, with weight capacities of 15 tons. What the maps didn't show, because the aerial photos were taken at the wrong angle, was that American engineers had already reinforced these bridges for their own traffic, creating demolition chambers in the process. The bridges existed, yes, but they were prepared for destruction in ways German planners never anticipated. Fuel allocation exposed the second fatal flaw. Knittel's battle group, of approximately 1,000 men and 200 vehicles, received authorization for 50,000 liters of gasoline, theoretically enough for 100 kilometers of road march. But the allocation assumed movement in convoy on paved roads at steady speeds with minimal combat. It didn't account for cross-country maneuvering through forests, stop-and-go traffic in potential jams, idling in fighting positions, or the simple reality that armored cars and half-tracks consumed far more fuel under combat conditions than during peacetime exercises. Staff officers had calculated fuel requirements using garrison training data, not combat experience. The numbers looked good in briefing rooms. They would prove catastrophically inadequate in Belgium's winter hills. The intelligence failure regarding American forces was perhaps the most inexcusable. German maps showed the 99th Infantry Division spread across a 25-kilometer front, roughly 1 battalion every 8 kilometers. Planners assumed this indicated weak screening forces that would crumble under assault. What they failed to understand was that American doctrine concentrated strength at key points rather than spreading evenly. The actual American deployment placed reinforced battalions at critical road junctions, with artillery pre-registered on likely German approach routes, and combat engineers prepared to blow bridges at dozens of locations. The Americans weren't thinly spread, they were coiled springs waiting to snap shut. German intelligence had confused deployment geography with defensive weakness. On December 10th, 5 days before the offensive, Sepp Dietrich conducted the final briefing for Kampfgruppe commanders at 6th Panzer Army headquarters. Knittel attended, received his written orders, and then participated in a smaller session afterward, where verbal instructions modified the written ones. This double layer of orders was standard SS practice, creating deniability if operations went wrong. The written orders emphasized speed and bridge seizure. The verbal orders made clear that nothing, absolutely nothing, should slow the advance. Bypass strong points. Ignore prisoners if they complicated movement. Brush aside civilians. The bridges at Stavelot and the fuel depots beyond them mattered more than tactical niceties. Knittel acknowledged understanding and returned to his battalion to brief company commanders. His company commanders, men who'd survived the Eastern Front, asked the obvious questions during their own planning session. What if the Americans blow the bridges? What if we can't find the fuel dumps? What if American air power appears once the weather clears? Knittel's answers, preserved in post-war interrogations, revealed his awareness of the plan's fragility. He told them they'd improvise, that reconnaissance units were trained to adapt, that the entire German army was betting on surprise and momentum. But he also emphasized one non-negotiable point. Speed was everything. Any company that slowed to fight a prolonged engagement would be abandoned. Any vehicle that broke down would be left behind. They would move fast or they would fail, and failure meant being cut off deep behind American lines with no supplies and no retreat route. The maps Knittel received showed a clean path through Belgium. Reality would prove messier. The maps indicated primary roads as 3-lane highways capable of handling heavy traffic. Most were actually 2-lane country roads, bordered by ditches and stone walls, totally unsuitable for armor maneuvering off pavement. The maps showed Stavelot as a small agricultural town with one bridge. They failed to note that the town occupied steep terrain above the Amblève River, creating natural defensive positions. The maps indicated distances in kilometers, but didn't account for gradient, for the fuel-draining effect of climbing and descending hills in winter conditions. Every technical detail in the plan assumed best-case scenarios. Combat would deliver worst-case realities. On December 14th, 2 days before H hour, Knittel personally drove forward to the German side of the front lines, conducting a final terrain reconnaissance. He couldn't cross into American-held territory, but he could observe the roads his battalion would use, check their condition, verify they matched the maps. What he found was concerning. The roads were narrower than indicated, already churned into frozen mud by military traffic. If it snowed, and weather reports suggested it would, these routes would become bottlenecks. He returned to his command post and revised his movement plan, building in additional time for congestion. But he couldn't revise the fuel allocation, couldn't change his orders, couldn't express doubt without appearing defeatist. So he prepared his men for the mission, knowing the plan was optimistic, hoping that German tactical skill and American inexperience would bridge the gap between fantasy and achievement. Hope, it turned out, was not an operational strategy. December the 16th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning, the Ardennes forest lit up as 1,800 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-kilometer front. The barrage fell on American positions that had been quiet sectors, rest areas where inexperienced divisions came to learn the basics of frontline duty. Shells crashed through the pine forests, demolishing command posts, severing communication lines, killing men in their sleep. It was the largest German artillery concentration on the Western Front since 1940, and it announced that Germany still had teeth. But for Kampfgruppe Knittel, 8 kilometers behind the start line, the artillery barrage meant something else entirely. It meant waiting, burning precious fuel in idling engines, watching the clock tick away. The plan called for the reconnaissance battalion to cross the start line at 0700 hours, 2 hours after H hour, following in the wake of assault infantry who would clear the forward American positions. But the plan hadn't accounted for the geography of assault. 3 German divisions were trying to funnel through the same narrow road network, what the Germans called rollbahns, rollways. Rollbahn D, Knittel's assigned route, was supposed to handle 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend Infantry, 1st SS Panzer Division Leibestandarte armor, and various support units. On paper, traffic control points would sequence the flow. In reality, at 0730, Knittel's lead vehicles reached their jump-off position and found the road completely blocked by Volksgrenadier troops who'd stalled under American defensive fire. Knittel climbed out of his command half-track and worked his way forward on foot to assess the situation. What he found wasn't a temporary jam, but a fundamental breakdown. The Volksgrenadier regiment that was supposed to clear the route had run into elements of the American 99th Infantry Division that refused to collapse as predicted. American troops were fighting from bunkers and foxholes, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned the road into a killing zone. The Volksgrenadier commander had no idea when he'd break through. Could be an hour, could be never. Meanwhile, behind Knittel's column, other units were stacking up, creating a traffic jam that stretched back 3 kilometers. The offensive was 90 minutes old and already achieving gridlock rather than breakthrough. At 0800 hours, Knittel made his first critical decision. Rather than wait for the Volksgrenadiers to clear the assigned route, he'd detour eastward, using a secondary road that paralleled Rollbahn D, but ran through heavier forest. It wasn't on his approved route list, which meant he'd be navigating without traffic control or engineer support. But it was movement, and movement was the mission. He radioed his company commanders, outlined the new route, and ordered the column to turn east. The first vehicles were in motion by 0815. Within 30 minutes, they'd bypassed the traffic jam and were advancing through forest trails that barely qualified as roads, branches scraping against vehicle sides, soldiers ducking as low-hanging pines threatened to sweep them from open hatches. The detour worked, technically. By 1100 hours, Knittel's lead elements had covered 15 kilometers and were approaching the village of Losheim, which intelligence indicated was lightly held. They hit their first significant resistance at 1130. American outposts from the 99th Infantry Division had established roadblocks using felled trees and mines. The engagement that followed wasn't the predicted 15-minute fight to brush aside demoralized troops. It was a 3-hour battle as American soldiers used the forest terrain expertly, falling back from one defensive position to the next, forcing Knittel's men to dismount and fight as infantry. By 1400 hours, the roadblocks were clear and the Americans had withdrawn, but Knittel's ammunition expenditure was already at 30%, well above projections for the first day. Meanwhile, radio communications brought fragmentary reports of how other elements of the offensive were progressing. Kampfgruppe Knittel, the armored spearhead that Knittel was supposed to follow, had gotten ahead by taking risks with bridge weight limits and bypassing American strongpoints even more aggressively. Piper was already 20 kilometers forward of Knittel's position, moving so fast that the gap between the two Kampfgruppen was widening rather than closing. Higher headquarters radioed Knittel at 14:30 with a simple message: accelerate, bridges critical, close on Piper. There was no acknowledgement of the traffic jams, the detours, the fighting, just pressure to move faster through conditions that made speed impossible. Fuel consumption was emerging as the silent killer. The reconnaissance vehicles, particularly the 8-wheeled SDK-FZ 234 armored cars, were designed for road use. Driving cross-country through forests, navigating around obstacles, running at combat idle during firefights, all consumed gasoline at rates 50% above normal. By 1600 hours, Knittel's quartermaster reported they had burned through 40% of their allocated fuel while completing only 30% of the planned first-day advance. The mathematics were brutal. At current consumption rates, they'd run dry before reaching the Meuse, long before. And the first scheduled fuel resupply, supposed to arrive at 1800 hours at a rendezvous point in Manderfeld, never appeared. The supply trucks were stuck in the same traffic jams that had delayed Knittel that morning. As darkness fell on December 16th, Knittel called a halt at 2100 hours near the village of Hansfeld. His battalion had advanced 18 kilometers in 15 hours of movement. The plan had called for 50 kilometers. They were 60% behind schedule after one day. He gathered his company commanders for a quick assessment. Second Company reported 8 vehicles with mechanical issues, 2 total breakdowns already abandoned. First Company had taken 14 casualties from American artillery during the Losheim fight. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to reduce effective strength. Third Company, his half-track mounted infantry, reported ammunition at 60% and requested resupply. Everyone reported fuel as the primary concern. Knittel's radio operator finally established contact with Leibstandarte Division headquarters at 2200 hours. The conversation was tense. Division wanted to know his exact position, his estimate for reaching Stavelot, his fuel status. Knittel reported honestly: 18 kilometers advanced, fuel critical, resupply failed to arrive, still operational but behind schedule. The response from Division was cold. Resupply en route. Continue advance 0400. Bridges must be seized December the 17th. Essential to operation. Translation: we know you have problems, we don't care. Complete your mission. The radio call ended. Knittel stood in the winter darkness, looking at his exhausted men, his fuel gauges reading half empty, and calculated the odds of success. They weren't good. The first day had revealed what the staff planners had missed or ignored. The Ardennes wasn't open terrain where armor could maneuver freely. It was a maze of forests, hills, rivers, and villages, all connected by inadequate roads. The Americans weren't green troops waiting to surrender at the first shot. They were combat soldiers who understood defensive terrain and used it well. And the German logistics system, stretched thin after years of losses, couldn't deliver supplies forward through congested routes under American artillery fire. Every assumption underpinning the offensive was proving false. But Knittel couldn't stop, couldn't retreat, couldn't even pause long enough to regroup properly. The plan demanded forward movement regardless of conditions. So, forward they would go, into a trap whose jaws were already closing. December the 17th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. Gustav Knittel read the radio message a second time, as if repetition might change the content. Close on Piper immediately. Bridges are critical. Bypass resistance. Speed essential. The order had come directly from 6th Panzer Army headquarters, jumping the normal chain of command. That meant desperation. Somewhere forward, the offensive was experiencing a crisis that required Knittel's battalion to accelerate, despite fuel shortages, despite exhaustion, despite the gathering evidence that the plan was collapsing. He folded the message paper and issued orders. The column would move in 30 minutes. Anyone too exhausted to drive would be left behind with the maintenance crews. Speed was now the only objective. The chase began in darkness and winter fog. Knittel placed himself in the fourth vehicle, close enough to the front to make quick decisions, but far enough back to see the entire column's flow. His lead element consisted of 3 SDKF's 234 armored cars, their 8-wheeled configuration giving them speed on roads, but making them vulnerable to mines and anti-tank weapons. Behind them came the half-tracks carrying infantry, then the headquarters section, then the supply vehicles that were mostly empty now. The column stretched 5 kilometers when fully extended, a mechanized snake winding through Belgian hills. They moved without headlights, navigating by the dim blue slivers of convoy lights that couldn't be seen from the air, but barely illuminated the road ahead. By 0900 hours, they'd covered 20 kilometers and reached the outskirts of Ligneville, a small town that sat astride their route to Stavelot. Intelligence had indicated light American presence, maybe a supply unit or headquarters company. The reality was an organized roadblock with felled trees, almost certainly mines, and American troops in firing positions on the buildings flanking the road. Knittel faced the same choice that had confronted him repeatedly since the offensive began: fight through, which would take hours and cost casualties, or bypass, which meant leaving Americans in his rear but maintaining speed. The order was clear: bypass resistance. He pulled out his map and found a forestry trail that circled south of Ligneville through heavy woods. The detour was where tactical decisions crossed into moral territory. To reach the forest trail, Knittel's column had to pass through the Bonnier crossroads, where 5 roads met in open farmland. As his lead armored cars approached at 12:15, the scouts radioed back a terse report: bodies in field, American uniforms, recent. Knittel ordered the column to slow but not stop, to observe while passing. What his men saw, filtered through their reports, was a massacre site. Approximately 80 to 100 American soldiers lay in the snow, clearly POWs based on their positions and lack of weapons. Some bodies were still steaming in the cold air, indicating the killings had occurred within the last hour or two. Shell casings littered the ground. This was fresh. The decision Knittel made in the next 60 seconds would haunt the historical record for decades. He radioed his company commanders: continue movement, do not stop. Report what you observe. The column kept rolling through the crossroads at reduced speed, every soldier looking at the field, seeing the bodies, and then looking away as they accelerated toward the forest trail. No one dismounted to check for survivors. No one rendered aid. No one took photographs or collected evidence. The operational logic was clear: stopping would delay the mission. And the bridges at Stavelot mattered more than dead Americans. But the human and legal implications were staggering. Knittel's battalion had just witnessed a war crime and chose mission completion over intervention. What exactly the scouts saw, and what they reported to Knittel, would become one of the war's enduring mysteries. Post-war testimony varied wildly. Some soldiers claimed they saw only bodies, clearly dead from a distance. Others insisted they saw movement, survivors pretending to be corpses. Some mentioned hearing shots as they passed, suggesting the massacre was still ongoing or that someone was finishing off wounded. Knittel's own testimony shifted over the years. In his first interrogation, he claimed his scouts saw nothing unusual, just battlefield casualties. Later, he admitted they reported bodies, but maintained they appeared to be combat losses, not executions. By the 1960s, in interviews with German historians, he acknowledged knowing it was a massacre site, but insisted stopping would have accomplished nothing except endangering his mission. The forest detour took 2 hours. 2 hours of grinding through snow-covered trails never intended for armored vehicles. Tracks churned the frozen ground into slush. Vehicles high-centered on stumps hidden beneath snow. Twice the column had to stop, while engineers used explosives to clear fallen trees too large to push aside. But by 1600 hours, they'd bypassed Ligneville and were approaching Stavelot from the southeast. following the same route Kampfgruppe Piper had taken hours earlier. Knittel's radio operator picked up American transmissions, panicked voices reporting German armor in Stavelot, bridges still standing, requesting air support. The race was still on. Stavelot appeared through the winter twilight as a medieval town clinging to steep hills above the Amblev River. The bridge, Knittel's objective, was a single stone arch span approximately 65 meters long, built centuries earlier and reinforced in the 1930s. Intelligence photos had shown it could handle armored vehicles. What the photos hadn't shown was the town's geography, how buildings created choke points, how the approaches to the bridge were natural killing zones. As Knittel's lead elements entered the town's outskirts at 1800 hours, American defensive fire erupted from multiple positions. Tracers arced through the gathering darkness. The first German armored car took a hit that shredded its tires, blocking the narrow street. The situation was tactically desperate. Knittel could see Kampfgruppe Piper's last vehicles disappearing across the bridge and heading northwest. That meant the bridge was intact and passable. But between Knittel's current position and that bridge lay approximately 120 American combat engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, men who knew the town's layout and had spent the day preparing defenses. His own force, after the detours and fighting, numbered approximately 600 effectives, 12 operational armored cars, 25 half-tracks, and 4 attached Panther tanks that had caught up with his column during the forest bypass. The Americans were outnumbered 5-1, but held defensive positions in close terrain where armor advantages disappeared. Knittel launched his first assault at 1845. As darkness completed its fall, the attack was violent but uncoordinated. Companies pushing forward independently because the town's layout prevented unified command and control. American engineers fought from cellars and upper windows, using bazookas at close range where German armor couldn't elevate guns to return fire. The narrow streets became corridors of death where vehicles couldn't maneuver, and infantry had to advance in the open. Within 30 minutes, Knittel had lost 3 armored cars and taken 35 casualties. The attack stalled 100 meters from the bridge, so close he could see the structure through the smoke, yet impossibly far. At 19:30 hours, he ordered withdrawal to reorganize. As his men pulled back to covered positions on Stavelot's eastern edge, Knittel received reports that completed the day's disasters. First Company commander was wounded. Second Company down to 8 operational vehicles. Third Company reporting ammunition at 40%. The fuel situation was beyond critical. Vehicles were running on fumes, with maybe 4 to 6 hours of combat operation remaining. And most damning, scouts reported American forces moving to cut the roads south and north of Stavelot, the routes Knittel had used to arrive. He was, potentially, about to be trapped in a hostile town, low on everything that mattered, with his supply line cut behind him. The bridges were 100 meters away. They might as well have been 100 kilometers. The chase had ended in stalemate, and dawn would bring American reinforcements. December 18th, 1944. 3 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to -8 degrees Celsius, cold enough that weapons froze and wounded men died from exposure before medics could reach them. In the ruined buildings on Stavelot's eastern edge, Gustav Knittel assembled his surviving company commanders for a final briefing. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. They would attack in darkness, using the night to mask their approach and deny American defenders clear fields of fire. 3 companies would advance simultaneously along parallel streets, overwhelming the defenders through sheer momentum. No stopping for wounded, no pausing to clear buildings, just forward movement until they held the bridge or died trying. Questions were brief. Everyone understood this was likely their last operation as an effective unit. At 03:30, the attack began. The night assault transformed Stavelot into a hellscape of muzzle flashes and screaming metal. Knittel's infantry dismounted from their half-tracks 2 blocks from previous positions and advanced on foot, using darkness and suppressive fire to close with American positions. The American engineers, caught off guard by the night attack's violence, fell back toward the bridge in fighting retreat. By 0400 hours, German infantry had reached the bridge's eastern approach, engaging Americans in hand-to-hand combat in the pre-dawn darkness. A Panther tank pushed forward through rubble, its main gun firing point-blank into buildings where Americans had established firing positions. The bridge itself remained intact, its stone bulk untouched by the fighting swirling around it. At 0430, the first German vehicles rolled onto the bridge, 3 armored cars and 2 half-tracks carrying infantry who immediately fanned out to establish a bridgehead on the western bank. American resistance on that side was lighter, the engineers having concentrated most of their force defending the eastern approach. Within minutes, German soldiers were fighting house to house in Stavelot proper, the part of town that rose steeply from the river's western bank. The bridge was effectively captured, though not secured. American engineers still held positions with line of sight to the span, and their radios were calling for air support, for artillery, for any assets that could destroy the crossing before it became an invasion route. Dawn brought American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers, screaming in at low level to strafe the bridge and its approaches. The first pass caught 2 half-tracks in the open on the bridge, rockets turning them into burning wrecks that blocked the center span. Subsequent waves targeted any vehicle movement near the crossing, forcing Knittel to halt reinforcements until the aircraft departed. For 3 hours, from 0900 to 1200, American air power owned Stavelot's sky. German anti-aircraft fire was ineffective, the flak vehicles having been left behind during the rapid advance due to fuel shortages. Knittel's bridgehead force of approximately 60 men on the western bank fought isolated from support, holding a perimeter measured in meters rather than kilometers. The house-to-house fighting in Stavelot proper reached an intensity that veterans would compare to Stalingrad. The town's medieval layout, with buildings adjoining each other and narrow alleys connecting streets, favored defenders who knew the terrain. American engineers had prepared explosive charges in key buildings, demolishing them when German infantry got too close, creating rubble barriers that channeled attackers into killing zones. By noon, the fighting had dissolved into squad-level actions, small groups of men fighting room to room with grenades and submachine guns. Knittel, commanding from a cellar near the bridge's eastern approach, received reports of progress measured in individual houses captured, individual streets cleared. The advance was succeeding, but at a terrible cost. Ammunition expenditure during the 18-hour battle reached levels that shocked even veteran quartermasters. German infantry companies fired an average of 80% of their allocated small arms ammunition. Machine gun teams went through entire belts in minutes during the intense close-range fighting. The Panther tanks, lethal in open terrain, found themselves nearly useless in the town's confines and burned through high explosive shells attempting to suppress American positions and buildings. By 1400 hours, Knittel's ammunition stocks were critically low. He radioed Leibstandarte Division headquarters requesting emergency resupply. The response was sympathetic, but useless. Supply convoys were trying to reach him, but were blocked by American interdiction fire on the approach routes. At 1400 hours, Knittel committed his final reserves. The battalion headquarters company that normally handled administrative and support functions. These were clerks, mechanics, radio operators, men with basic infantry training, but no combat experience. He sent them forward with simple orders: push through to the western bank, expand the bridgehead, link up with the isolated force already there. The attack succeeded through sheer weight of numbers. By 1600 hours, German forces held a continuous line across the bridge and approximately 2 blocks into Stavelot's western districts. The bridge, the critical objective that had consumed 36 hours of continuous combat, was finally fully secured. But the victory was Pyrrhic. Casualties during the December 18th assault were catastrophic by any measure. German forces lost approximately 200 men, killed or seriously wounded, representing 30% of Knittel's effective combat strength. American casualties were lighter, around 80 killed or wounded. But the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The civilian cost was harder to calculate in the fog of battle. Witnesses reported seeing Belgian civilians caught in crossfire, buildings collapsing with families sheltering in cellars, desperate people trying to flee through streets where any movement drew fire from both sides. The exact number wouldn't be known until the fighting ended, and survivors could count their dead. The bridge itself bore the scars of battle. The stone arches remained intact, testament to medieval engineering. But the road surface was cratered from near-miss bombs and artillery. The wrecked half-tracks from the morning air attack still blocked one lane, German engineers working under fire to push them over the side into the river below. Most critically, the bridge showed signs of attempted American demolition. Knittel's engineers found explosive charges wired to the support structures, the detonators connected but not fired. Investigation revealed the wiring had been damaged, possibly by German artillery during the night assault, possibly by the American engineers themselves in the chaos of retreat. The bridge had survived by accident, not German tactical genius. As darkness fell on December 18th, Knittel conducted a grim accounting. His battalion held the bridge and approximately one-third of Stavelot. But he'd lost 35% of his combat strength, fired 80% of allocated ammunition, and his vehicles were operating on fuel fumes. Radio contact with higher headquarters had been intermittent for 6 hours, leaving him uncertain of the broader tactical situation. Scouts reported American forces moving to encircle Stavelot from north and south, threatening to cut his lines of communication. The fuel depot in town that intelligence had promised turned out to contain diesel, useless for his gasoline-powered vehicles. He'd won the objective, but he was isolated, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that was regrouping rather than retreating. The bridge was his. The question was whether he could hold it. December 18th, 1944, 2200 hours. In a damaged building that served as temporary headquarters, Gustav Knittel's staff conducted an inventory that read like a countdown to annihilation. Fuel, 12 hours at combat operations tempo, 6 hours if vehicles had to maneuver under fire. Ammunition, 4 hours at current expenditure rates before machine guns went silent and infantry fought with rifles only. Food. Soldiers were surviving on captured American K rations and whatever Belgian civilians could be persuaded or coerced to provide. Medical supplies. The battalion surgeon had 90 wounded men, 1 aid station, and enough morphine for perhaps 20 serious cases. The numbers told a simple story. Kampfgruppe Knittel was dying from resource starvation while technically holding its objective. The fuel crisis had metastasized from concerning to catastrophic. By midnight, approximately 40 vehicles sat immobile in Stavelot's streets, drained completely. Their crews had siphoned every remaining drop into the operational vehicles, creating a smaller but still functional combat force. Knittel made brutal calculations. The armored cars, his reconnaissance assets, got fuel priority. The half-tracks carrying infantry came second. The supply trucks, now empty anyway, were drained completely and abandoned. Panther tanks, fuel-hungry beasts designed for open warfare, sat silent because running them for even an hour would consume resources needed to keep 20 other vehicles mobile. The battalion was cannibalizing itself, contracting toward a core of vehicles that might, possibly, break out if ordered. Dawn on December 19th brought the realization that Kampfgruppe Knittel had become an island in what was supposed to be a fluid offensive. Radio contact, when it could be established through American jamming, brought fragmentary reports of the wider battle. Kampfgruppe, Piper, the spearhead that Knittel had chased, was surrounded at La Glaise, 12 kilometers northwest. American forces had cut the roads between Piper and Knittel. 1st SS Panzer Division's main body was stuck east of Stavelot, unable to advance because the single bridge couldn't handle the traffic volume. Other German units of 6th Panzer Army were reporting similar problems. Too many men and vehicles funneling through too few roads, with American artillery and air power turning every concentration into a killing zone. Knittel sent reconnaissance patrols southward at 0600 hours, trying to locate the supply convoys that division headquarters insisted were en route. The patrols returned 3 hours later with devastating news. The main supply route from Germany forward was under constant American artillery interdiction. Convoys attempting to move forward during daylight were being destroyed by air attack. Night movement was possible but slow, and even successful convoys were getting no closer than 15 kilometers from Stavelot before American blocking positions forced them to halt. The logistics chain hadn't just slowed, it had effectively severed. Knittel's battalion would receive no resupply on December 19th, possibly not on December 20th either. They were on their own. the wounded presented impossible choices. The 90 casualties from the bridge assault required evacuation to proper medical facilities, but evacuating them meant using fuel and vehicles needed for combat operations. Knittel ordered the most serious cases loaded onto trucks for an attempted evacuation convoy that evening, hoping darkness would provide cover. The convoy departed at 2000 hours, carrying 47 wounded and accompanied by 2 armored cars for protection. It traveled 8 kilometers before running into an American roadblock, took fire, lost 1 armored car, and returned to Stavelot with all the wounded still aboard. There would be no evacuation. The wounded would stay, draining medical supplies and occupying space in buildings needed for defensive positions. Medicine, like everything else, was running out. Food scarcity drove German soldiers into Belgian homes with demands that walked the line between requisition and robbery. Knittel issued orders that civilians were to be paid for food in Reichsmarks, maintaining a fiction of legal procurement, but hungry soldiers with weapons rarely respected such niceties. Complaints from Belgian civilians accumulated, forced entry into homes, food taken at gunpoint, livestock slaughtered in streets. Knittel responded by posting guards at remaining civilian gathering points and threatening his own men with summary courts-martial for unauthorized looting. But discipline was fraying along with everything else. Men who'd fought for 36 hours straight, who faced death in a foreign town far from home, weren't inclined to worry about property rights of enemy civilians. At 1600 hours December 19th, Knittel finally received clear radio contact with Leibstandarte Division headquarters. The conversation was surreal. Division staff seemed unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge Knittel's situation. When he reported fuel exhaustion, ammunition shortages, and isolation, the response was a repetition of earlier orders. Hold Stavelot, bridges critical, maintain position. He pressed for specifics. When would resupply arrive? When would the main body link up with his position? The answers were vague. Soon, efforts were being made. Higher headquarters was prioritizing logistics. Translation: no one knew when or if relief would come. He was ordered to hold with resources that wouldn't support holding, to maintain a position that was becoming a trap. Evening reconnaissance brought the final confirmation of encirclement. American forces, elements of the 30th Infantry Division and 82nd Airborne, had closed the roads north and south of Stavelot. The corridor that Knittel had used to advance was now an American-controlled zone. Radio intercepts indicated American commanders were planning a coordinated assault to retake Stavelot, probably within 24 to 48 hours. When that attack came, Knittel's diminished force would face fresh American units with full ammunition, loads, air support, and artillery. The tactical mathematics were brutal. He could hold for perhaps 1 day of serious fighting, 2 at most, before being completely overrun. And still no orders came authorizing withdrawal or breakout. Knittel spent the night of December 19th preparing 2 separate plans. One he could discuss on radio, and one he kept private. The official plan was static defense: fortify buildings, prepare fighting positions, hold until relieved. The private plan was breakout. Identify the weakest point in American encirclement, concentrate remaining mobile forces, punch through in a night attack, abandon the immobile and wounded, save whoever could be saved. He didn't share the breakout plan with anyone except his operations officer, but he refined it throughout the night, calculating routes, timing, which units would lead and which would form rear guard, preparing for the order that would make him either a savior or a war criminal, depending on whether it succeeded. At 2000 hours, a new radio message arrived that rendered all planning moot. Expect relief attack from East December 20th. Hold position until link up. Breakout not authorized. The message confirmed what Knittel had suspected. Higher headquarters was using Kampfgruppe Knittel as bait, hoping that American forces concentrating to destroy his battalion would leave gaps elsewhere that German armor could exploit. He and his men were pawns in a larger operational game, expendable pieces whose sacrifice might create opportunities for others. He acknowledged the message, ordered defenses strengthened, and watched the December darkness conceal his isolated command. The island had become a prison. Guards and inmates both wondered who would be left alive when morning came. January 14th, 1945. 3 weeks after the Ardennes offensive ground to failure, American graves registration teams worked in frozen fields near the Bonnier crossroads, carefully exhuming bodies that the snow had partially preserved. 84 corpses, American soldiers, from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Most showed single gunshot wounds to the head at close range. Some had injuries consistent with being shot while attempting to flee. This wasn't combat, it was execution. And somewhere in the confusion of documents, testimonies, and radio intercepts, investigators kept encountering a name, Knittel, not as a perpetrator, but as a witness, someone whose unit had been present at or near the massacre site, someone who might know what happened after the killing stopped. The investigation into the Malmedy massacre began with survivor testimony. Approximately 45 American soldiers had escaped the killing field by pretending to be dead, then fleeing when German attention shifted elsewhere. Their accounts described Kampfgruppe Piper's forces disarming them, forcing them into the field, then opening fire with machine guns and pistols. The timeline was clear. Capture around 1345, massacre beginning around 1415, ending by 1445 on December 17th. But multiple survivors mentioned something that didn't fit the Piper narrative. They described hearing more vehicles arriving after the shooting stopped, hearing different voices, German voices that seemed surprised or uncertain. Some mentioned seeing a second column of vehicles. These ones marked differently from Piper's tanks. American intelligence pieced together unit movements through captured German documents, radio intercepts, and prisoner interrogations. Kampfgruppe Piper's route was well documented, but the timeline showed another SS unit in the vicinity. SS Panzeraufklärungsabteilung 1, the reconnaissance battalion commanded by Gustav Knittel. According to German march tables and radio logs, Knittel's lead elements should have passed through the Bonnier crossroads sometime between 1430 and 1530. That placed them at the scene 30 to 90 minutes after the massacre, not during the killing, but potentially during its immediate aftermath. The question became, what did they see, and what did they do about it? May 1945. Gustav Knittel sat in an Allied interrogation center, no longer a major commanding a battle group, but a prisoner awaiting an uncertain fate. His initial interrogations focused on standard questions: unit composition, chain of command, operations conducted. Then, in his fourth session, the interrogator placed aerial photographs on the table showing the Bonnier crossroads. "Tell me about December 17th, the interrogator said. "Tell me about what your men saw in that field." Knittel's response, preserved in interrogation transcripts, was carefully measured. His reconnaissance scouts had reported American casualties at the crossroads. He assumed they were combat losses from earlier fighting. His orders were to maintain speed towards Stavelot. He didn't stop to investigate. The interrogator pressed harder. Had his scouts mentioned anything unusual about the bodies, their positioning, the number, whether any appeared to be wounded rather than dead? Knittel's answers grew more guarded. He didn't recall specific details from scout reports. The situation was confused. His focus was on the mission. Yes, he'd heard about bodies in a field. No, he didn't order anyone to investigate or render aid. Why would he? The offensive was ongoing. His unit had objectives. The dead were regrettable but irrelevant to his mission. The interrogator noted Knittel's affect during these responses, calm, unemotional, seemingly unbothered by the admission that he'd ignored potential war crimes to maintain operational tempo. August 1945 brought new evidence that complicated the narrative. American forensic teams examining the Bonnier site found shell casings from weapons that didn't match those typically carried by Piper's tank crews. Some casings came from 20mm cannon, the type mounted on reconnaissance vehicles like the SDKF Zato 234 armored cars in Knittel's battalion. Other physical evidence included track marks from 8-wheeled vehicles in the snow around the field's perimeter, again consistent with Knittel's armored cars rather than Piper's tanks. The evidence didn't prove Knittel's men participated in the massacre, but it suggested they'd been closer to the scene than Knittel admitted, possibly close enough to hear shots, certainly close enough to see exactly what had happened. Survivor testimony created additional problems for Knittel's version. Several American soldiers who'd escaped the massacre described seeing or hearing a second German column arriving while they hid in nearby woods. One survivor, Private Homer Ford, gave specific details: vehicles with SS markings but different silhouettes from the tanks that had been present during the shooting, voices speaking German but with different accents or dialects. The sense that these new arrivals were surprised by what they found. Ford couldn't be certain because he was hiding and traumatized, but his testimony suggested Knittel's scouts hadn't just observed from a distance. They'd been close enough to interact with the site, possibly close enough to see wounded survivors still moving. November 1945 brought a shift in the investigation's focus. Prosecutors realized they couldn't prove Knittel's men pulled triggers at Malmedy. The forensic evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. Survivor testimony was consistent, but lacked the specificity needed for murder charges. However, a different legal theory emerged: failure to report or intervene in war crimes. Under the Geneva Conventions and military law, commanders had obligations beyond not committing atrocities themselves. They had duties to prevent crimes by subordinates, to report crimes by other units, to render aid to wounded enemies. If Knittel's scouts saw the massacre site and reported it to him, and if he chose to ignore it without even notifying higher headquarters, that potentially constituted criminal negligence or complicity. The prosecution theory took shape through winter 1945 to 46. Knittel's battalion had arrived at Baugny sometime around 1500 hours, close enough to the massacre's end that wounded Americans might still have been alive. His scouts observed the scene and reported to him. He made a command decision: keep moving, don't investigate, don't render aid, don't report to division headquarters. That decision potentially allowed wounded to die who might have survived with medical attention. It certainly prevented immediate documentation of war crimes, and it fit a pattern of Eastern Front conduct where SS units routinely ignored atrocities because stopping to investigate would slow operations. The prosecution couldn't prove murder, but they believed they could prove criminal indifference. April 1946. Knittel was formally charged not as a primary defendant in the Malmedy massacre, but as a related case involving command responsibility and failure to prevent war crimes. The charges were carefully worded: that he knew or should have known his men witnessed war crimes, that he failed to investigate or report these crimes, that his failure potentially allowed additional deaths of wounded Americans. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling when assembled. Physical evidence placing his units at the scene, radio logs showing he'd been in communication with scouts at the relevant time, his own admissions that scouts reported bodies, the absence of any record that he'd reported the massacre to higher headquarters, and, most damning, the cold calculation in his own words: I felt that we were losing time. The Malmedy question, as it came to be known in legal proceedings, revealed uncomfortable truths about Wehrmacht and SS operations. The massacre itself was committed by Kampfgruppe Knittel. That was clear. But Knittel's response to discovering the massacre, the instinct to prioritize mission over morality, to treat atrocities as tactical inconveniences, exposed how deeply the Eastern Front's brutalization had infected German military culture. Knittel wasn't unusual in his indifference. He was typical. Thousands of German officers had made similar calculations. Objectives matter, dead enemies don't. Investigating crimes wastes time. The Malmedy question wasn't whether Knittel was guilty of murder. It was whether indifference to murder, when coupled with command authority, constituted its own form of criminality. The answer would define not just Knittel's fate, but the scope of command responsibility in international law. December 19th, 1944. 0800 hours. Major General Leland Hobbs, commanding the 30th Infantry Division, studied maps of Stavelot with the focused intensity of a surgeon planning an operation. His intelligence officers had spent the night piecing together the situation. An isolated German battle group held the town and its critical bridge, cut off from support, low on everything that mattered in modern war. The opportunity was obvious: crush this isolated force before German reinforcements arrived, recapture the bridge, sever one of the few routes the Ardennes Offensive had managed to open. Hobbs issued orders for a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The hammer would fall at noon. Kampfgruppe Knittel, whether they knew it or not, had hours left as an effective fighting force. The American plan was methodical, almost textbook in its construction. Elements of the 30th Infantry Division would attack from the north, pushing through Stavelot's upper town and driving German forces toward the river. Simultaneously, the 82nd Airborne Division, rushed south from reserve positions, would attack from the southeast, cutting off retreat routes and trapping Knittel's forces against the Amblev. Artillery from 3 battalions would provide continuous fire support, pre-registered on every German position identified through aerial reconnaissance. And critically, American tactical air controllers were standing by to call in fighter-bomber strikes the moment weather permitted. The Americans were committing approximately 5,000 troops to destroy a German force they estimated at 400 to 600 effectives. The math was deliberately overwhelming. Knittel received his first indication of the coming storm at 1100 hours when American artillery began systematic bombardment of Stavelot. This wasn't harassing fire or counter-battery shooting. This was preparation fire, the kind that preceded infantry assault. Shells walked methodically through the town, targeting buildings where German troops had established defensive positions, cratering streets to impede vehicle movement, cutting communication wires. His men huddled in cellars and reinforced positions, enduring the barrage with the fatalism of veterans who understood that when the shelling stopped, something worse would begin. At 11:45, the artillery shifted to screening fire on the town's outskirts. The assault was imminent. The American infantry came at noon precisely, advancing in company strength from multiple directions. German defenders, outnumbered and low on ammunition, fought with the desperation of men who understood they were making their last stand. Machine gun positions fired until barrels overheated. Then crews fell back to secondary positions and repeated the process. The Panthers, immobile due to fuel exhaustion, served as stationary pillboxes, their 88mm guns engaging American Sherman tanks at ranges where the German guns' superiority didn't matter because the Panthers couldn't maneuver. The fighting devolved into the same house-to-house brutality that had characterized the German assault 2 days earlier. But now, with roles reversed. By 1400 hours, American forces had penetrated into Stavelot's northern districts, capturing approximately 1/3 of the town Knittel's men had held that morning. German casualties mounted steadily, men killed by artillery, by small arms fire and street fighting, by building collapses, by American tanks firing into structures at point-blank range. Knittel's aid station was overwhelmed, wounded men lying in corridors because there was no room in the treatment areas. The battalion surgeon performing triage with the cold calculus of limited morphine and unlimited suffering. The wounded who might survive with immediate evacuation died slowly in the cellar that served as hospital. Those too badly wounded to move were left where they fell. The fuel crisis that had crippled German mobility for 2 days now became a death sentence. Vehicles that might have repositioned to meet American thrusts sat immobile, becoming fixed targets for American tank destroyers. Half-tracks that could have evacuated wounded or brought forward ammunition sat useless, their fuel tanks bone dry. The few operational vehicles burned their remaining gasoline in short, desperate movements, relocating to threatened sectors, but each movement consumed irreplaceable fuel. By 1600 hours, Knittel was down to 6 operational armored cars and 3 half-tracks. Everything else was abandoned, destroyed to prevent capture, or simply out of fuel and waiting for American infantry to arrive. December 20th brought the crisis to its inevitable conclusion. American forces attacking from the south linked up with units pushing from the north, effectively cutting Stavelot into isolated German pockets rather than a continuous defensive line. Knittel's command post, established in a reinforced cellar near the bridge, lost contact with 2 of his 3 remaining companies. Radio communications had degraded to the point of uselessness, damaged equipment and American jamming reducing effective range to a few hundred meters. He was commanding blind, issuing orders to runners who often didn't return, making decisions based on the sound of gunfire rather than actual intelligence. The Wehrmacht's vaunted tactical coordination had collapsed into small unit actions fought by sergeants and lieutenants who knew they were on their own. At 0400 hours on December 20th, Knittel received the order he'd been expecting and dreading. Breakout authorized. Withdraw to German lines. Preserve combat capability. The message came through in fragmented bursts as his radio operator struggled with failing equipment and enemy interference. Preserve combat capability. The phrase was almost insulting. His combat capability was shattered. He had perhaps 400 men still able to fight, maybe 10 operational vehicles, ammunition measured in magazines rather than cases. But the order was clear. Get out. Save whoever could be saved. Leave the rest. He began issuing orders for a fighting withdrawal to begin at dawn. The breakout attempt started at 0600 hours, under cover of morning fog. Knittel concentrated his remaining mobile forces on the southern route toward Trois Ponts, hoping American encirclement was weakest in that direction. The column that began moving was pathetic compared to the battle group that had entered Stavelot 4 days earlier. Approximately 350 men, 8 vehicles, the walking wounded mixed with combat effectives, because there was no transport for the seriously injured. They left behind 90 men too badly wounded to walk, surrendering them to American forces with hope for medical treatment. They also abandoned every immobile vehicle, setting demolition charges on a timed fuse to deny them to the enemy. The Kampfgruppe that had been Knittel's pride was dissolving in real time. American forces hit the breakout column within the first kilometer. Artillery fire, called in by forward observers who spotted the German movement, turned the road into an eruption of high explosives. The lead armored car took a direct hit that killed its crew instantly and blocked the narrow road. Infantry attempted to bypass through adjacent fields, but ran into American positions that had been waiting for exactly this maneuver. The firefight that followed lasted 40 minutes and cost Knittel another 60 casualties. When his remnants finally broke clear of American contact, they had lost 2 more vehicles and left behind anyone too slow or unlucky to keep pace with the retreat. The column that emerged from the killing zone numbered approximately 280 men. The retreat through Trois Ponts completed the destruction. American engineers had prepared the bridges for demolition, and as Knittel's last vehicles crossed, explosives detonated behind them. Dropping the spans into the river, the blast wave knocked soldiers off their feet. Stone blocks that had stood for centuries plunged into the Amblev, taking with them any possibility of German forces using this route for future operations. Knittel stood on the eastern bank, watching the bridge collapse, understanding that Kampfgruppe Piper was now completely cut off to the northwest. The mission to secure bridges had ended with bridges destroyed. The operational objective was ashes. December 21st, 2200 hours. The survivors of Kampfgruppe Knittel reached German lines near Recht, stumbling into friendly positions more as refugees than as soldiers. Final count. Approximately 400 men out of the original 1,000, 40% strength. Equipment losses were total. 18 armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned, 35 half-tracks lost, over 60 trucks gone. But the human cost went beyond numbers. These were men who'd fought brilliantly, achieved impossible objectives, held against overwhelming odds, and still lost everything. They'd learned the lesson that tactical excellence meant nothing against strategic failure, that bravery couldn't overcome logistics collapse, that being right in battle didn't matter when the entire war was wrong. They'd held the bridge was gone. They'd completed their mission. The mission had been pointless, and morning would bring new orders to prepare for new operations, because the offensive wasn't over, and Germany hadn't yet accepted that defeat was inevitable. December 18th, 1944. 11 in the morning, in the cellar of a stone house on Rue Neuve in Stavelot, 17 Belgian civilians huddled in darkness as the world above them tore itself apart. Artillery shells crashed into buildings. Machine gun fire rattled through streets. The sound of tracked vehicles grinding over cobblestones mixed with shouted German commands and occasional screams. Marie Poncelet, 53 years old, held her 2 grandchildren and prayed in French, counting seconds between explosions, trying to determine if the fighting was moving closer or receding. Then the floor above them collapsed inward as a shell scored a direct hit. Dust and debris rained down. When the screaming stopped and survivors dug themselves out, 3 family members were dead, and the war had come down into the cellar with them. The civilian population of Stavelot in December 1944 numbered approximately 1,300 people, mostly elderly, women, and children. The young men were gone, some conscripted into Belgian labor battalions, others fled or hiding. When German forces entered the town on December 17th, most civilians retreated to cellars, the same survival strategy that had worked during the 1940 invasion. But this battle was different. The confined urban terrain, the house-to-house fighting, the use of tanks firing at point-blank range into buildings, all created conditions where cellars became tombs. Stone structures that had sheltered families for generations offered no protection against 88mm tank shells or American 500-pound bombs. The first civilian casualties came from crossfire, the inevitable result of combat in populated areas. But as the battle intensified, eyewitness accounts began documenting something darker. On December 19th afternoon, German soldiers allegedly entered houses on the eastern edge of town and executed civilians found inside, claiming the buildings had been used as firing positions by American forces. Belgian survivors described soldiers checking cellars, finding people hiding, and shooting them without warning or interrogation. The accounts were consistent across multiple witnesses. German troops, identified by SS camouflage smocks, entering specific addresses, emerging minutes later, bodies discovered after German withdrawal. 8 civilians died in these incidents on Rue Neuve alone. American artillery created its own civilian catastrophe. The bombardment preceding the December 19th counterattack was comprehensive and indiscriminate, targeting every building in German-held sectors without regard for civilian presence. Forward observers, positioned on hills overlooking Stavelot, called in fire missions on structures showing any sign of German occupation. But distinguishing between a house occupied by German soldiers and one sheltering terrified civilians was impossible from 1,000 meters away through morning fog. Entire families died in cellars as artillery fire collapsed buildings on top of them. One American artillery battalion alone fired over 2,000 shells into Stavelot on December 19th. The statistical probability that none of those shells killed civilians was 0. The liberation of Stavelot on December 20th revealed the extent of civilian suffering. American troops advancing through captured sectors found bodies in ruins, families crushed by collapsing masonry, individuals who'd bled to death from shrapnel wounds with no medical help available. Belgian civilians emerging from cellars were often hysterical, traumatized by 4 days of continuous combat, fought literally over their heads. American civil affairs officers attempted to conduct casualty counts, but the chaos made accurate accounting impossible. Bodies were buried in hasty graves. Entire families were missing. Some civilians had fled into the countryside during lulls in fighting and wouldn't return for weeks. The initial estimate was 30 to 40 civilian dead. The number would grow. February 1945 brought Belgian government investigators to Stavelot, tasked with documenting civilian losses and determining causation. What they found was a moral and evidentiary maze. Of approximately 130 civilian deaths eventually confirmed, roughly 60% showed injuries consistent with artillery or aerial bombardment. 30% died from small arms fire, either in crossfire or direct engagement. The remaining 10%, approximately 13 individuals, showed execution-style wounds, single gunshots to the head or back at close range, in locations and circumstances that made battlefield casualties unlikely. The question became, who was responsible, and could responsibility even be meaningfully assigned in the chaos of urban combat? The investigation focused particularly on the incidents at Rue Neuve and similar addresses where witnesses claimed German forces executed civilians. Physical evidence supported some claims. Bodies found in cellars with gunshot wounds from weapons above them. Shell casings from German submachine guns found at scenes. Timing that corresponded to German occupation of those sectors. But establishing beyond doubt that these were deliberate executions rather than tragic mistakes during house-clearing operations proved nearly impossible. German soldiers clearing buildings in close combat sometimes fired first and identified targets later. The line between war crime and terrible accident blurred in combat's fog. Gustav Knittel's post-war testimony regarding civilian casualties was characteristically careful. He acknowledged that civilians died during the Stavelot fighting. He admitted his troops engaged in house-to-house combat where civilian presence was likely. But he denied issuing any orders for reprisal killings or targeting of non-combatants. His claim was that civilian deaths were regrettable but inevitable consequences of urban warfare, not war crimes. When confronted with specific allegations about Rue Neuve executions, he stated he had no direct knowledge of such incidents and that if individual soldiers committed crimes, they did so against his orders. The testimony was legally sound and morally hollow, acknowledging everything while accepting responsibility for nothing. The Belgian government's final report, published in late 1945, assigned blame carefully and controversially. It documented German forces' responsibility for civilian deaths through house-clearing operations that showed insufficient care for non-combatant presence. It also documented American responsibility for civilian deaths through artillery bombardment that made no distinction between military and civilian targets. The report concluded that approximately 50 civilians died due to German action, 50 due to American action, and 30 in circumstances too confused to assign clear responsibility. Both occupying forces had treated Stavelot's civilian population as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of military objectives. The legal aftermath was unsatisfying for survivors seeking justice. No American forces faced charges for civilian deaths caused by artillery, those deaths being classified as unfortunate but lawful consequences of combat operations. German accountability focused primarily on the suspected execution cases, particularly the Rue Neuve incidents. Several members of Knittel's battalion were eventually questioned about these specific allegations during the broader Malmedy trial proceedings, but securing convictions proved nearly impossible. Witnesses couldn't identify specific individuals. Physical evidence was circumstantial, and the defense argument that soldiers in close combat made tragic mistakes under stress created reasonable doubt. Most civilian deaths at Stavelot would remain officially unexplained, neither accident nor crime, but simply the cost of war. Marie Poncelet survived the battle, but lost her husband, her daughter, and one grandchild to the fighting. In interviews conducted in the 1960s, she struggled to assign blame. The Germans were shooting, she recalled. The Americans were shelling. We were in the middle, trying not to die. I don't know whose bullet killed my husband. I don't know whose shell crushed my daughter. All I know is that soldiers from both sides cared more about their bridges and their tactics than about whether we lived or died. Her testimony captured something essential about the civilian experience of Stavelot. It wasn't a story of uniquely German criminality or American carelessness. It was a story of modern warfare's fundamental incompatibility with civilian survival, of urban combat's transformation of homes into battlefields and families into statistics. The bridges that Kampfgruppe Knittel fought so hard to capture were rebuilt within months. The families destroyed in that fighting could never be reconstructed. December 16th, 1944, 1,400 hours. In railway marshalling yards east of Cologne, German quartermasters supervised the loading of fuel trains that would, theoretically, sustain 6th Panzer Army's offensive. Tank cars filled with gasoline, trucks carrying jerry cans, horse-drawn wagons hauling drums. The entire logistical apparatus of mechanized warfare assembled and ready for movement forward. The calculations looked precise on paper. 4.5 million liters of fuel allocated for the first 5 days. Enough to move armor 100 kilometers, fight sustained engagements, and still maintain operational reserves. The mathematics were perfect. The mathematics were also fantasy, disconnected from the reality of winter roads, Allied air power, and combat consumption rates that bore no resemblance to peacetime projections. The first fuel convoy destined for Kampfgruppe Knittel departed the railhead at 1600 hours on December 16th, 6 hours after the offensive began. 30 trucks, each carrying 2,000 liters of gasoline, escorted by 2 armored cars for protection. The route to the forward supply point at Manderfeld was 60 kilometers, theoretically 3 hours' drive in good conditions. The convoy took 9 hours, arriving at 0100 on December the 17th. Traffic jams on Rollbahn D, forced detours through forest trails never intended for heavy trucks. Twice the convoy halted while engineers cleared destroyed American vehicles from roads. When the trucks finally reached Manderfeld, they found chaos rather than an organized supply point. No fuel distribution infrastructure existed. No one knew which units needed fuel most urgently. The convoy waited 4 hours for orders, while the fuel Knittel desperately needed sat in trucks 20 kilometers from his position. American tactical air power transformed German logistics from difficult to impossible. December 18th brought clear skies for the first time since the offensive began, and Allied fighter bombers appeared in numbers that shocked German commanders who'd grown accustomed to Luftwaffe control in the war's earlier years. P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings hunted supply convoys with devastating efficiency. Between dawn and dusk on December 18th, American airstrikes destroyed an estimated 12 fuel trucks attempting to reach Stavelot, killed over 80 logistics personnel, and forced all daytime supply movement to halt. The convoys that did move, traveling at night without headlights on ice-covered roads, proceeded at walking pace and suffered accident rates that destroyed nearly as many vehicles as enemy action. The fuel consumption projections that looked reasonable in planning proved catastrophically wrong in execution. German staff officers had calculated fuel requirements based on garrison training data. Armored cars consuming X liters per 100 kilometers on paved roads at steady speeds. But combat was nothing like garrison training. Vehicles spent hours idling in traffic jams, engines running to provide heat in sub-zero temperatures, consuming fuel while covering zero distance. Cross-country maneuvering through snow and mud doubled or tripled consumption rates. Combat operations, with sudden accelerations, high-speed pursuits, and maneuvering under fire, burned fuel at rates that made staff calculations look absurd. Knittel's battle group used approximately 85,000 liters by December 19th, compared to the allocated 50,000. They had exceeded their 5-day fuel budget in 3 days. The captured American fuel dumps that German planning had relied upon turned out to be a mirage. Intelligence had identified major Allied fuel storage sites near Stavelot and Spa, supposedly containing millions of liters waiting to be seized. The reality was different. American commanders, warned by intelligence of a possible German offensive, had evacuated or destroyed most forward fuel stocks in the operation's opening hours. The dumps that German forces did capture contained primarily diesel fuel, useless for German vehicles that ran on gasoline. At one location, Knittel's quartermasters found 200,000 liters of fuel, enough to solve the entire battle group's crisis. 70% was diesel. The remainder was contaminated with water, probably sabotaged by American engineers during hasty retreat. Knittel's men tried running the contaminated gasoline through filters, but the effort was futile. The fuel crisis continued. The infrastructure limitations of the Ardennes road network created bottlenecks that no amount of fuel could solve. 6th Panzer Army's entire logistics flow depended on 3 main supply routes, Rollbahns C, D, and E, running from German railheads forward to the combat units. But these weren't modern highways. They were 2-lane country roads with stone bridge crossings, steep gradients, sharp curves, and villages where buildings narrowed roadways to single-lane passages. When supply convoys met combat units moving forward or damaged vehicles blocking lanes, traffic jams extending for kilometers resulted. At one point on December 19th, a single destroyed truck on Rollbahn D created a 6-hour delay for every vehicle behind it, including fuel trucks desperately needed at the front. German military police attempted to enforce traffic discipline, but the sheer volume of vehicles exceeded the road network's capacity. Comparative analysis reveals the scale of German logistical delusion. The U.S. Army's famous Red Ball Express, supporting Allied operations after Normandy, employed over 6,000 trucks running continuous shuttle missions on dedicated routes to sustain far smaller advances than the Ardennes Offensive attempted. The Germans tried to sustain an 80-kilometer offensive using perhaps 2,000 trucks on roads under enemy air attack. The Americans had engineer battalions specifically dedicated to road maintenance and improvement. The Germans hoped Belgian roads would simply hold up under armor traffic. American logistics planned for consumption rates 30% above projections. German logistics assumed peacetime efficiency during winter combat. The comparison wasn't even close. German logistical planning was hope masquerading as strategy. The human cost of logistics failure appeared in thousands of small tragedies. Wounded soldiers died waiting for ambulances that couldn't reach them through traffic jams. Infantry companies ran out of ammunition during firefights. Their supply trucks stuck 20 kilometers back on roads they couldn't navigate. Tank crews abandoned operational vehicles because no fuel existed to run them. Artillery batteries rationed shells to 3 per day, when American counter-battery fire was falling in dozens of rounds per minute. At Stavelot, Knittel's men scavenged food from Belgian civilians because German ration trucks never arrived. Logistics wasn't abstract staff work. It was the difference between soldiers who could fight and soldiers who starved, froze, or died holding empty weapons. December 24th brought the final accounting of logistics failure. 6th Panzer Army had advanced a maximum of 40 kilometers at its deepest penetration, less than half the planned first-day objective. Fuel consumption for the entire army had reached 6 million liters, 1.5 million more than allocated for 5 days. Of the fuel that reached forward areas, approximately 40% was lost to spillage, contamination, or destruction before reaching combat units. American forces, by contrast, were receiving supply tonnage that exceeded consumption, building stockpiles while Germans exhausted theirs. The logistical race was over before most tactical engagements concluded. Germany had brought insufficient resources to an extended fight and demonstrated, once again, that tactical skill meant nothing when operational sustainability collapsed. Post-war analysis by military historians identified the logistics failure as the Ardennes Offensive's ultimate cause of defeat, more significant than tactical losses or American tactical performance. One study calculated that even if every German tactical objective had been achieved on schedule, the offensive would have stalled by December 21st due to fuel exhaustion alone. Another analysis determined that sustaining the offensive for the planned 7 days would have required fuel delivery rates 3 times higher than German logistics could theoretically provide, even without Allied interference. The conclusion was damning. The Ardennes offensive was mathematically impossible from inception, not due to combat losses, but due to arithmetic. Kampfgruppe Knittel's fuel crisis wasn't a local failure. It was the entire German war effort in microcosm, attempting operations that looked feasible on maps, but dissolved into impossibility when physical reality intervened. December 22nd, 1944. 0900 hours. In a snow-covered field near wrecked Belgium, Gustav Knittel conducted the grim ritual of unit reorganization after catastrophic losses. 380 men answered roll call, down from the 1,000 who'd crossed the start line 6 days earlier. 8 operational vehicles remained from over 200 that had begun the offensive. The men looked like refugees more than soldiers, uniforms torn and filthy, faces showing the hollow-eyed exhaustion of continuous combat without rest, weapons functioning but barely maintained. Knittel stood before them without notes or prepared speech, and delivered the news that everyone had expected. The battalion would be reconstituted. They would remain in combat. The war wasn't over. For men who just survived Stavelot's hell, the promise of more fighting felt less like duty than cruelty. The reconstitution process revealed how completely the Wehrmacht had scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel. First, Panzer Division Leibstandarte sent Knittel 150 replacements on December 28th. Paperwork identified them as reconnaissance troops. Reality was harsher. 70 were Luftwaffe ground crew, mechanics and radio operators retrained as infantry over 2 weeks. 40 were Kriegsmarine sailors whose ships no longer existed, given rifles and taught basic squad tactics. 25 were recovered wounded from earlier Eastern Front battles, men who'd been medically cleared to return to duty, but whose physical limitations made them marginal soldiers. The final 15 were teenage conscripts, some as young as 17, who'd never fired their weapons outside training ranges. These were the soldiers expected to restore Kampfgruppe Knittel to combat effectiveness. Equipment replacement fared little better. Division Quartermaster delivered 4 SDKF-Z 234 armored cars pulled from other depleted reconnaissance units, vehicles showing wear and battle damage hastily repaired. 12 SDKF-Zs, 2 51 half-tracks arrived, but only 8 had functioning radios. The supply section received 3 trucks, and promises of more to come, promises everyone knew were empty. Most critically, ammunition allocation remained at 50% of authorized loads. Division explained that artillery units had priority for shells. Infantry would have to make do with less. The mathematics were simple. Knittel was being asked to return to combat with 40% of original manpower, 20% of original vehicles, and half the ammunition of a full-strength battalion. Success under these conditions required either miracles or suicide missions, likely both. December 27th brought the first new mission. 1st SS Panzer Division was holding a defensive line near St. Vith, a communications hub that American forces were determined to recapture. Knittel's reconstituted battalion received orders to occupy a 4-kilometer sector on the division's northern flank, screening against American reconnaissance and preventing infiltration. It was a mission perfectly suited to a reconnaissance battalion's capabilities and completely impossible with Knittel's actual strength. 4 kilometers of front normally required a full infantry battalion of 800 men. He had 380, and a quarter of those were untrained replacements. His company commanders protested that the sector was too wide, that American probes would find the gaps, that they lacked the strength to both screen and maintain reserves. Knittel agreed. Then he issued orders to comply, because refusing was unthinkable. The defensive position near St. Vith introduced Knittel's survivors to a new kind of misery. At Stavelot, they'd fought aggressively, seizing objectives, maintaining initiative even while surrounded. Defense was different. It meant sitting in frozen foxholes while American artillery searched for German positions. It meant enduring without advancing, absorbing casualties without the adrenaline rush of attack to make suffering seem purposeful. The winter of 1944 to 45 was brutally cold, temperatures dropping to -15 Celsius at night. Soldiers with inadequate winter clothing developed frostbite. The Luftwaffe replacements, trained for aircraft maintenance, not field soldiering, suffered particularly badly. 6 were evacuated with cold weather injuries in the first week. The defensive line held, but it was eroding through attrition rather than combat losses. January 3, 1945, brought another mission that demonstrated German command's disconnection from reality. American forces were tightening the noose around Bastogne, and 6th Panzer Army was ordered to mount a limited counterattack to relieve pressure on the encircled town. Kampfgruppe Knittel would participate as part of a larger assault force, advancing 5 kilometers to seize an American supply route. The operation launched at 0600 in darkness and winter fog. Knittel's battalion advanced 300 meters before running into American defensive positions that intelligence had claimed didn't exist. The firefight lasted 4 hours. German forces gained 50 meters of snow-covered ground at cost of 30 casualties. The counterattack was called off at 1100 hours. Everyone returned to start positions having accomplished nothing except demonstrating that German offensive capability was exhausted. Combat effectiveness assessments conducted on January 1st rated Kampfgruppe Knittel at 30% of full capability. The assessment was bureaucratic language for a unit that was combat ineffective by any reasonable standard. Too few men to hold assigned sectors. Too few vehicles for mobility operations. Too little ammunition for sustained engagements. Training levels inadequate due to high percentage of recent replacements. Morale described as satisfactory but declining, which meant soldiers were following orders but had lost faith in victory. The assessment recommended pulling the battalion from line for complete rebuilding. Higher headquarters acknowledged the recommendation and ordered the battalion to remain in combat because no reserve units existed to replace them. 30% effective was better than 0%. And the front needed bodies to fill positions. The final withdrawal from Belgium began January 15th as American forces launched Operation Northwind, a massive offensive to eliminate the Bulge completely. German units that had advanced into Belgium in December now retreated in January, fighting rearguard actions to slow American pursuit. Knittel's battalion covered the withdrawal of larger formations, establishing temporary defensive positions, holding for hours until nearly overrun, then falling back to the next position. It was the mission reconnaissance units were designed for, trading space for time, inflicting casualties while avoiding decisive engagement. But the cumulative losses were devastating. By January 20th, Knittel's effective strength had dropped to 200 men, 6 vehicles, and ammunition loads measured in individual magazines rather than cases. January 25th marked the end of Kampfgruppe Knittel's combat operations in the Ardennes. The remnants of the battalion, now barely company strength, were pulled from the line and ordered back to Germany for complete reconstitution. The unit that assembled for transport looked nothing like the confident reconnaissance battalion that had crossed the start line 39 days earlier. These were survivors, men who'd seen their comrades die in frozen fields, who'd held impossible positions against overwhelming forces, who'd completed every mission despite conditions that made success unthinkable. Knittel himself was physically and emotionally exhausted, having lost 15 kilograms from an already lean frame. Division medical officers recommended he be hospitalized for exhaustion and possible depression. He refused, stating he'd stay with his men until they reached safety in Germany. On January 26th, he collapsed during a staff meeting and was forcibly evacuated to a field hospital, ending his personal participation in the war's final chapters. The final accounting for Kampfgruppe Knittel's operations. December 16th through January 25th was statistical testimony to futility. Of approximately 1,000 men who began the offensive, 290 were killed in action, 380 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, 120 taken prisoner, leaving roughly 200 still with the unit when operations ceased. Equipment losses totaled over 90% of authorized vehicles. Territory gained measured in kilometers was entirely surrendered by month's end. Bridges captured were recaptured or destroyed. American forces inconvenienced were replaced and reinforced. The unit had fought brilliantly, demonstrated tactical skill that earned praise even from enemies, and accomplished absolutely nothing of strategic value. Every soldier killed, every vehicle destroyed, every desperate stand fought. All had purchased temporary delays that meant nothing when measured against the war's trajectory. Kampfgruppe Knittel had been sacrificed on the altar of strategic delusion, proof that bravery and skill couldn't overcome fundamentally flawed strategy. The survivors would carry that knowledge into uncertain futures, wondering if their efforts had been courage or simply waste. May 1945. A detention facility in southern Germany. Allied interrogators sat across bare tables from captured German generals and staff officers, conducting what would become known as the Ardennes Offensive debriefings. The questions were methodical. What were the planning assumptions? Where did intelligence fail? When did commanders realize the offensive couldn't succeed? The answers revealed a pattern of willful delusion layered over tactical competence, a case study in how professional military organizations can execute operations they know intellectually cannot succeed, while hoping emotionally that somehow reality will bend. General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We knew the numbers didn't support success, but we also knew doing nothing guaranteed defeat. So we attacked and hoped for luck we didn't deserve. The foundational assumption underlying the entire Ardennes offensive was American military incompetence. German planning documents explicitly stated that U.S. forces were inexperienced, poorly led, and likely to collapse under sustained pressure. This wasn't intelligence analysis, but wishful thinking, masquerading as assessment. Yes, some American divisions in the Ardennes were green, newly arrived in theater, but the Germans conveniently ignored that other American divisions were veteran formations, that American artillery was excellent, that air support was overwhelming when weather permitted. The plan required Americans to behave like the collapsing French armies of 1940. Instead, they fought like the determined Soviets of 1943. The assumption of enemy weakness was fantasy. The The fuel calculations, examined in post-war analysis, revealed planning divorced from physical reality. German quartermasters estimated that 6th Panzer Army would consume 4.5 million liters reaching the Meuse River. American logistics experts examining the same operational plan calculated actual consumption would be at least 7 million liters, probably closer to 10 million when accounting for combat conditions, winter operations, and traffic delays. The German numbers weren't wrong due to miscalculation. They were wishful, representing what Germany could deliver rather than what operations would actually consume. Planning backward from available resources to define possible operations, then calling that possible operation the plan, guaranteed failure. Reality doesn't adjust to accommodate insufficient logistics. Time and space analysis revealed mathematical impossibilities embedded in the operational schedule. The plan called for German armored spearheads to reach the Meuse River, 90 kilometers from start lines, within 48 hours. This required average advance rates of approximately 2 kilometers per hour, continuously, for 2 days. The fastest German advances in France, 1940, against a collapsing enemy on better roads, averaged 1 kilometer per hour. The assumption that troops could move twice as fast against prepared defenses in winter on worse roads defied every historical precedent. Kampfgruppe Knittel's experience proved typical. 18 kilometers advanced on day 1 versus the planned 50. The timeline wasn't optimistic. It was delusional. Force ratios at critical points revealed another fatal flaw. German operational doctrine, based on Eastern Front experience, assumed breakthrough required 3-to-1 superiority at point of attack. In the Ardennes, German forces achieved local superiority of perhaps 1.2 to 1 at best. Nowhere did they approach 3-to-1. American defensive density was higher than German intelligence had predicted, and American reserves could arrive faster than German planners anticipated. The arithmetic was brutal. Even perfect German execution would have created small, temporary penetrations that American reserves could seal before exploitation became possible. Kampfgruppe Knittel encountered this reality at Stavelot, achieving temporary success that American reinforcements reversed within 48 hours. The air power imbalance made sustained operations impossible once weather cleared. German planning assumed several days of bad weather would ground Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to advance without air interdiction. This assumption proved partially correct. Initial days saw limited Allied air activity, but the plan made no provision for what happened when weather improved. December 18th brought clear skies and American air dominance so complete that daytime movement became suicidal. German supply convoys were destroyed, troop concentrations bombed, communications severed. The Luftwaffe was absent, unable to contest Allied air superiority with the few operational aircraft remaining. Betting an entire offensive on weather continuing to favor Germany for a week was gambling rather than planning. Comparative case studies illuminate the Ardennes offensive's fundamental flaws. German operations in France, 1940, succeeded because they exploited genuine weakness in French command structures, used interior lines of communication Germany no longer possessed in 44, and faced an enemy whose morale was already breaking. Soviet offensives in 1943 and 44 succeeded through overwhelming material superiority, accepting casualty rates Germany couldn't sustain, and operating on a scale that made local setbacks irrelevant. The Ardennes offensive combined France's 1940s ambition with none of its advantages, attempting Soviet-scale penetration without Soviet-scale resources. It was strategic fantasy. The counterfactual question haunts any analysis. What if everything had gone perfectly for Germany? What if American forces had collapsed as predicted, roads remained clear, fuel captured in sufficient quantities, weather stayed bad for a week? Post-war wargaming by military colleges attempted to answer this. The consensus: even under perfect conditions, German forces would have reached the Meuse, perhaps established small bridgeheads, then stalled as American reserves arrived and logistics collapsed. The absolute best case, the scenario where every assumption proved correct and every break went Germany's way, still resulted in operational failure within 10 days. The plan couldn't succeed even in theory. much less in the messy reality of winter combat. Gustav Knittel's experience with Kampfgruppe provided microcosm validation of every strategic failure. He was a skilled tactician executing an impossible mission with inadequate resources against an underestimated enemy. His troops fought brilliantly, achieving local objectives through courage and initiative, and they failed anyway because tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic stupidity. The bridges he captured were retaken or destroyed. The fuel he needed never arrived. The American forces, he was told, would collapse, instead reinforced and counterattacked. Every element of the plan that depended on German advantage proved false. Every assumption that downplayed Allied capabilities proved wrong. Knittel did everything right tactically and still lost operationally because the strategy was fundamentally flawed. The ultimate question was whether German commanders recognized the plan's impossibility and proceeded anyway, or genuinely believed success was possible. Evidence suggests a mix. Senior commanders like Rundstedt and Model expressed skepticism in planning meetings, noting resource shortfalls and unlikely assumptions. But they proceeded because Hitler demanded offensive action, and refusing meant relief or worse. Junior commanders like Knittel received the plan without being consulted on its feasibility, expected to execute rather than question. The result was an organization where everyone privately doubted success, but no one officially acknowledged doubts, creating collective delusion through individual silence. Germany attacked in the Ardennes, not because winning was possible, but because accepting defensive strategy felt like admitting defeat. The offensive became a suicide note written in soldiers' blood, a desperate last gesture by a regime that chose theatrical failure over pragmatic survival. Kampfgruppe. Knittel's story was that gesture made flesh, brave men dying for strategy that served propaganda rather than military logic. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across the collapsed Third Reich, millions of German soldiers faced the moment they'd dreaded: surrender. For members of Kampfgruppe Knittel, scattered across prisoner of war camps from France to Poland, the end of combat brought new uncertainties. Some surrendered to American forces in orderly formations, relieved the killing had stopped. Others fled eastward, terrified of Soviet captivity, only to be rounded up by British troops. A few simply walked away from disintegrating units, discarding uniforms and attempting to vanish into civilian populations. The unit that had fought as cohesive brotherhood through the Ardennes now fragmented into individual stories of survival, judgment, and reckoning with what they'd done and witnessed. Hauptsturmführer Werner Wolf, who'd commanded 2nd Company during the Stavelot assault, surrendered to American forces near Munich on May 2nd. Interrogation records show a cooperative prisoner who provided detailed information about unit operations, equipment, and tactics. He made no attempt to minimize German actions or claim ignorance of atrocities. When asked about Malmedy, he confirmed his company had passed the crossroads approximately 90 minutes after the massacre, had seen bodies in the field, had reported to Knittel, and had continued moving without investigating. His justification was operational necessity. His tone, according to interrogators, was matter of fact rather than remorseful. Wolf spent 18 months in prisoner of war camps before release in December 1946. He returned to his home in Bavaria, worked as an accountant, never spoke publicly about the war. He died in 1973. Unterscharführer Franz Becker, a half-track driver who'd survived the entire Ardennes campaign, had a different trajectory. Captured by Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia during the final weeks of war, he endured 5 years in labor camps near Stalingrad. The irony wasn't lost on him, as he later wrote, that he survived combat against the Soviets only to spend years rebuilding the city German forces had tried to capture. He returned to Germany in 1950, weighing 45 kilograms, suffering from tuberculosis and psychological trauma. Employment was difficult for former SS members in the immediate post-war period. Becker worked manual labor jobs, married, had children. In 1987 interviews for an oral history project, he described the Ardennes offensive as the moment we knew we'd lost everything but kept fighting anyway. He died in 1994, having never returned to Belgium or visited the battlefields. The medical officer, Dr. Heinrich Müller, faced particular moral reckoning. He'd performed battlefield surgery in Stavelot cellars, treating wounded without adequate supplies, making triage decisions that condemned some men to die so others might survive. After the war, he testified in war crimes proceedings about conditions during the battle, providing medical expertise on wound patterns and casualty circumstances. His testimony was considered credible and neutral, focusing on medical facts rather than legal arguments. He returned to civilian medical practice in Hamburg, specializing in trauma surgery. Colleagues noted he never discussed his war service, but would occasionally make cryptic references to decisions no doctor should have to make. He committed suicide in 1968. His note mentioned nightmares about Stavelot, but provided no elaboration. The youngest veterans, the teenage conscripts thrown into combat during the final weeks, struggled with different demons. Karl Schneider was 17 during the Ardennes Offensive, assigned to Knittel's battalion in late December. He participated in the fighting retreat through January, saw men die in their first combat action, killed at least one American soldier in close-range firefight near St. Vith. After the war, he completed education, interrupted by military service, became a teacher, married, but interviews in the 1990s revealed lasting trauma. "I was a child playing soldier," he said, "except the bullets were real and my friends died, and I can't explain to anyone what that does to you." Schneider became active in German peace movements, speaking at schools about war's reality. He died in 2003. Casualty statistics told broader stories. Of the approximately 1,000 men who comprised Kampfgruppe Knittel on December 16, 1944, 290 were killed in action during the Ardennes campaign and subsequent fighting. 380 were wounded seriously enough to require hospitalization. 120 became prisoners of war. The remaining 210 survived to surrender in May 1945, though survived covered a spectrum from physically intact to psychologically destroyed. Death rates varied by role. Infantry suffered 40% casualties, vehicle crews 25%, headquarters staff 15%. The numbers were clinical. Behind each statistic was someone's son, brother, father, erased or altered by decisions made in distant headquarters. Post-war dispersal patterns reflected Germany's post-war divisions. Approximately 40% of survivors returned to Bavaria and Austria, traditional recruiting grounds for Leibstandarte. 30% settled in northern Germany, often in locations far from their origins, seeking anonymity. 15% emigrated, primarily to South America, where former SS members faced fewer questions. The remainder disappeared into the chaos of post-war displacement, either dying in the immediate post-war period or successfully concealing their identities. By 1950, the unit that had been brotherhood forged in combat existed only as scattered individuals connected by memories they often couldn't or wouldn't share. War crimes prosecutions touched approximately 8 members of Kampfgruppe Knittel, though establishing individual guilt for specific actions proved nearly impossible. The Malmedy trial proceedings included testimony from multiple battalion members, but none faced murder charges directly. Instead, charges focused on command responsibility, failure to prevent crimes, and the Stavelot civilian casualties. Convictions were limited and sentences light compared to concentration camp personnel or Einsatzgruppe members. Most received sentences of 5 to 15 years, reduced on appeal or through clemency as Cold War politics prioritized West German integration over justice for wartime crimes. By 1953, all imprisoned members of Kampfgruppe Knittel had been released. Veterans organizations emerged in the 1950s, created officially for mutual support, but often serving as forums for historical revisionism. The Leibstandarte Veterans Association, formed in 1952, ostensibly to provide assistance to widows and disabled veterans, but also to coordinate legal defenses and shape historical narratives. Early publications presented the Ardennes Offensive as tragic but honorable sacrifice, emphasizing tactical achievements while minimizing atrocities or strategic futility. Knittel himself participated in early meetings before legal problems limited his involvement. The organization gradually evolved, especially after reunification, to acknowledge more nuanced historical truth. By the 2000s, it focused primarily on maintaining cemeteries and supporting historical research rather than defending the indefensible. The last surviving officer of Kampfgruppe Knittel, Obersturmführer Paul Richter, died in 2008 at age 91. His funeral in a small Bavarian village drew fewer than 20 attendees, mostly family. No military honors, no speeches about glory or sacrifice. Just burial of an old man who'd been young during terrible times and carried those memories silently to the grave. The few surviving enlisted men had passed away even earlier, their stories largely unrecorded, preserved only in fragmentary documents and fading memories. By 2010, no living members of Kampfgruppe Knittel remained to offer first-hand testimony about those December days in Belgium. The unit had passed from living memory into history, a transition that freed scholars to examine evidence without survivors' protests, but also lost irretrievable human details that documents couldn't capture. What remained were records, ruins, and the obligation to understand what happened, not to condemn or absolve, but to ensure the lessons weren't forgotten by generations who would never hear survivors speak. July 16, 1946. Dachau, Germany. The former concentration camp had been transformed into a war crimes tribunal facility, a deliberate symbolic choice to try perpetrators in a place synonymous with Nazi atrocity. Courtroom D, a converted barracks building filled with military personnel, journalists, and observers as the Malmedy trial formally opened. 74 defendants sat in rows, former SS soldiers accused of murdering American prisoners of war and Belgian civilians during the Ardennes Offensive. Among them, though not as primary defendant, was Gustav Knittel, charged with command responsibility for civilian deaths at Stavelot and failure to report war crimes witnessed at Malmedy. His presence illustrated the trial's complexity, distinguishing between combat actions, war crimes, and the gray zones where military necessity intersected with moral failure. The prosecution's case against Knittel focused on two distinct allegations. First, that his battalion had participated in or witnessed the Malmedy massacre and failed to report it or render aid to wounded survivors. Second, that during the battle for Stavelot, troops under his command executed Belgian civilians in reprisal for alleged partisan activity. The evidence was circumstantial but extensive. Physical evidence placed his units near Malmedy at relevant times. Witness testimony described German soldiers and reconnaissance vehicles at the crossroads after the shooting. At Stavelot, Belgian survivors identified German soldiers in camouflage smocks, consistent with SS reconnaissance troops, entering houses and emerging after gunfire. The prosecution argued that even if Knittel hadn't personally pulled triggers, his command position made him responsible for his subordinates' actions. Defense attorneys, German lawyers working with American military counsel, challenged every element of prosecution theory. They argued the timeline placed Knittel's scouts at Malmedy after the massacre concluded, meaning they witnessed aftermath, not the crime itself. They presented evidence that American artillery had caused most Stavelot civilian casualties, not German ground forces. They emphasized the chaos of urban combat, where split-second decisions determined survival, arguing that alleged execution sites were actually locations where house-clearing operations tragically killed non-combatants. And they highlighted a procedural problem that would ultimately undermine the entire trial: interrogation techniques used to obtain confessions. January 1947 brought the trial's first major crisis. Defense attorneys presented affidavits from defendants claiming they'd been physically and psychologically abused during interrogation. The allegations were specific: mock executions where prisoners were told they'd be shot, beatings that left no visible marks, isolation in freezing cells, threats against families. American interrogators denied most allegations but admitted to using harsh techniques justified by the seriousness of the crimes under investigation. The tribunal ordered investigation into interrogation methods, temporarily halting proceedings. What emerged was damaging. While systematic torture hadn't occurred, interrogators had used coercion that violated American military regulations and potentially tainted confessions. The controversy over interrogations transformed the trial from straightforward war crimes prosecution into a debate about American legal procedure. U.S. media covered the allegations extensively, with some outlets suggesting the trial was revenge rather than justice. Politicians in Washington began questioning whether convictions obtained through questionable methods would withstand appellate review. The political dimension intensified as Cold War tensions escalated. By early 1947, American policy was shifting from punishing defeated Germany to rebuilding West Germany as anti-Soviet ally. Lengthy prosecutions of German soldiers for ambiguous wartime actions began looking counterproductive to broader strategic goals. Knittel's specific testimony occurred in March 1947, 2 days of examination that revealed his character and limitations. He answered questions precisely, acknowledging facts while denying criminal intent. Yes, his scouts reported bodies at Malmedy. No, he didn't investigate because operational tempo didn't permit delays. Yes, civilians died during Stavelot fighting. No, he didn't order executions and wasn't aware of any occurring. His testimony was legally careful and morally hollow, treating atrocities as unfortunate complications rather than crimes demanding action. Cross-examination focused on his Eastern Front experience, suggesting that 3 years of brutal warfare had normalized atrocities to the point where witnessing mass murder didn't trigger the moral alarm it should have. Knittel denied this characterization, but couldn't explain why he'd felt no obligation to investigate what his scouts described. May 1947 brought verdicts. Of 74 defendants, 43 were convicted of various charges, 31 acquitted or charges dismissed. Knittel was found guilty of command responsibility for civilian deaths at Stavelot, specifically that he failed to prevent or punish subordinates who executed non-combatants. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. The sentence was middle range, heavier than defendants found responsible only for combat actions, lighter than those convicted of direct participation in massacres. 2 of Knittel's subordinates received death sentences for specific killings at Stavelot. Though these would later be commuted, the verdicts satisfied no one. Victims' families thought sentences too lenient. Defense attorneys considered convictions unjust given interrogation problems. Historical justice existed somewhere between these positions. The appellate process revealed how political considerations override legal ones when governments decide expediency matters more than consistency. 1948 brought a Senate investigation into Malmedy trial procedures, driven partly by genuine concerns about due process and partly by political pressure from constituencies that viewed German integration as more important than punishing wartime crimes. The investigation found that while confessions had been obtained through improper coercion, actual trial proceedings had met minimum standards of fairness, but the political damage was done. Public perception shifted from viewing defendants as war criminals to seeing them as possible victims of victor's justice. Clemency and sentence reductions began almost immediately after convictions. Cold War imperatives drove policy changes as American officials recognized that maintaining large numbers of German prisoners created diplomatic problems with the West German government they were simultaneously trying to strengthen. Knittel's sentence was reduced to 10 years in 1949, then to 8 years in 1951. The 2 subordinates facing death sentences had those commuted to life imprisonment, then reduced to 20 years, then further reduced. By 1953, Knittel was released having served just 6 years of his original 15-year sentence. Most Malmedy trial defendants were free by 1954, less than a decade after their crimes. The long-term impact on international law was more significant than individual fates. The Malmedy trial established precedents for command responsibility, the principle that commanders are legally accountable for subordinate actions they knew or should have known about. This concept would be refined through subsequent tribunals from Yugoslavia to Rwanda to the International Criminal Court. The trial also illustrated tensions inherent in victor's justice. The same Allied powers prosecuting Germans for civilian killings during military operations had themselves killed civilians through strategic bombing campaigns. The hypocrisy didn't exonerate German defendants, but it complicated moral narratives and provided ammunition for defense attorneys arguing selective prosecution. Gustav Knittel's release in 1953 marked the end of formal accountability, but not of controversy. He lived quietly in Bavaria, working administrative jobs, avoiding publicity. When contacted by historians in the 1960s, he declined most interview requests. The few statements he made maintained consistent positions. He'd been a soldier following orders. Civilian deaths were tragic but inevitable in urban warfare. He bore no personal guilt for actions taken under combat conditions. He expressed no remorse, offered no apologies, showed no indication that he'd reconsidered his wartime decisions. When he died in 1976, obituaries in German newspapers described him as a controversial figure without elaborating. The trials had assigned legal guilt and imposed punishment. They hadn't achieved anything approaching moral reckoning or genuine understanding of how ordinary men became participants in extraordinary evil. 1956. A small publishing house in Munich released Steel Front, the story of Kampfgruppe Knittel, authored by a former SS officer under a pseudonym. The book presented the Ardennes Offensive through lens of tragic heroism. German soldiers fighting brilliantly against impossible odds. Betrayed by inadequate logistics and Hitler's strategic delusions, their tactical achievements overshadowed by unjust war crimes prosecutions. Malmedy was mentioned in one paragraph as alleged incidents never conclusively proven. Stavelot civilian casualties were attributed entirely to American artillery. The narrative was mythology masquerading as history, but it sold well in a West Germany eager to rehabilitate military service divorced from Nazi ideology. The battle for how Kampfgruppe Knittel would be remembered had begun. The American counter-narrative emerged through official military histories in the early 1960s. Charles MacDonald's A Time for Trumpets, published in 1963, presented the Ardennes Offensive from American perspective. Inexperienced divisions holding under desperate assault. Engineers blowing bridges to prevent German breakthrough. Ultimate victory through courage and logistic superiority. Kampfgruppe Knittel appeared as a dangerous but ultimately defeated enemy formation, skilled in tactics but serving an evil cause. The book mentioned Malmedy extensively, but treated Knittel's role as peripheral. Stavelot was portrayed as American defensive triumph, civilian casualties acknowledged but not analyzed in detail. This version became semi-official American memory, taught in military academies and repeated in documentaries. Belgian historians, writing from position of victimhood, produced different narrative entirely. A 1981 study by local researchers in Stavelot, Civilians in the Crossfire, documented every civilian death in the town during December 1944. The work was meticulously researched, interviewing survivors, examining medical records, even exhuming bodies for forensic analysis. Its conclusions challenged both German and American narratives. Yes, German forces had executed civilians in specific incidents, but American artillery had killed more civilians than German ground forces. The study argued that both armies treated Belgian non-combatants as expendable, that their military objectives mattered more than civilian protection. The book received limited circulation outside Belgium, but represented important corrective to narratives that simplified moral accountability. The 1990s brought archival openings that revolutionized understanding. Soviet archives released after the Cold War contained German documents captured in 1945, including logistics planning for the Ardennes Offensive. These documents proved what skeptics had long suspected. German planners knew fuel calculations were inadequate, knew timeline was unrealistic, proceeded anyway. American declassification of intelligence documents revealed the extent of pre-offensive warnings that were ignored or misinterpreted. British archives contain prisoner interrogations with details never included in official histories. Suddenly, researchers could cross-reference sources from multiple nations, catching contradictions and filling gaps. The new evidence didn't resolve all controversies, but provided unprecedented detail. Antony Beevor's 2015 book, Ardennes, 1944, synthesized decades of research into accessible narrative that challenged comfortable myths. His treatment of Kampfgruppe Knittel was nuanced, acknowledging tactical skill while not excusing atrocities, examining logistics failure without absolving individual responsibility, placing unit actions in broader context of SS institutional brutality. The book angered German veterans organizations, who felt it overemphasized criminality while underplaying military professionalism. It also drew criticism from some American historians for questioning whether Allied air power and artillery had exercised adequate discrimination, protecting civilians. Beaver's work represented mature historical synthesis, uncomfortable for those preferring simple narratives of good versus evil. Digital archives in the 2010s enabled unprecedented research access. Researchers could examine individual soldier records, cross-reference radio logs with combat reports, map unit movements hour by hour. This granular detail resolved some long-standing questions while raising new ones. For example, GPS mapping of reported German positions at Malmedy on December the 17th, combined with vehicle speed calculations, suggested Knittel's lead elements could have arrived earlier than he claimed, potentially during the massacre itself. But the same analysis showed American witness estimates of vehicle numbers were inflated, suggesting confusion between different German units. Technology provided tools for precision, while revealing how much remained genuinely unknowable. The major historiographical controversy centered on intentionality versus circumstance. Did Kampfgruppe Knittel commit war crimes through deliberate criminal policy? Or did atrocities result from combat chaos and individual failures of discipline? German apologists emphasized the latter, arguing that urban warfare inevitably produced civilian casualties, that individual soldiers made tragic mistakes under stress. Critics emphasized the former, noting that SS units had institutional cultures shaped by Eastern Front brutality, that Knittel's command decisions reflected callous disregard for non-German lives. The evidence supported both interpretations depending on which incidents you examined. Some civilian deaths at Stavelot clearly resulted from deliberate execution. Others were clearly artillery casualties. The remainder existed in gray zones that resist clear categorization. Modern consensus among serious historians acknowledges complexity while not excusing criminality. Kampfgruppe Knittel was a skilled tactical formation executing an operationally impossible mission. Its soldiers demonstrated courage, initiative, and professional competence. They also participated in, or witnessed atrocities without intervening, prioritized military objectives over civilian protection, and benefited from institutional SS culture that normalized brutality. All of these statements are simultaneously true. The challenge for historians is maintaining that complexity against pressures to simplify into good guy, bad guy narratives. War, particularly on the Eastern and Western fronts in 1944, produced situations where brave soldiers serving evil causes committed crimes while also demonstrating martial virtue. Reconciling those contradictions requires nuanced analysis that resists both demonization and rehabilitation. Unanswered questions persist 8 decades later. The precise timeline of Knittel's units at Malmedy remains disputed, with evidence supporting arrival times ranging from 1430 to 1530. The exact number of civilian executions at Stavelot versus artillery casualties will never be definitively established because forensic evidence was contaminated or destroyed. Whether Knittel received verbal orders to ignore atrocities can't be proven either way, because such orders wouldn't have been documented. These gaps frustrate historians seeking definitive conclusions, but accurately reflect the fog of war and deliberate concealment by participants with self-interest in obscuring truth. The historiographical battle over Kampfgruppe Knittel matters because it's a microcosm of larger debates about Wehrmacht and SS, about German military professionalism versus Nazi criminality, about whether skill and courage can be acknowledged without excusing service to evil. The unit's story resists simple narratives. They were neither cartoon villains nor misunderstood heroes, but human beings operating in extreme circumstances who made choices ranging from necessary to criminal. How we remember and analyze those choices shapes how we think about war, responsibility, and the relationship between individual action and institutional evil. The battle for historical memory continues in classrooms, museums, and archives, fought not with weapons, but with evidence, interpretation, and the obligation to understand complexity without surrendering moral judgment. Truth is harder than myth, but truth is what the dead deserve, present day. The bridge at Stavelot still stands, rebuilt after the war, using the original stone foundations. Tourists walk across without knowing they're stepping over ground, where hundreds died in 72 hours of winter combat. A small plaque on the southern approach mentions fierce fighting in December 1944, but provides no details about units involved or civilians killed. The Amblève River flows beneath the arches as it has for centuries, indifferent to human conflict. Standing here on a quiet morning, watching Belgian children cross the bridge on their way to school, you can almost forget that this peaceful town was once hell. Almost. But forgetting is exactly what we cannot afford to do. Military academies around the world still study the Ardennes Offensive, and Kampfgruppe Knittel's operations feature prominently in logistics and operational planning courses. The lesson isn't subtle. Tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic stupidity. Students at Fort Leavenworth, Sandhurst, and Saint Cyr examine German march tables, fuel consumption rates, and timeline projections, then calculate the mathematical impossibility of success. They learn that no amount of courage or skill at company and battalion level can compensate for theater-level planning that ignores physical reality. One instructor at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College uses Knittel's experience as the semester's final case study. "Show me how you would have succeeded where he failed," the instructor challenges students. Year after year, no one can, because the mission was impossible from inception. The logistics lessons resonate beyond military circles. Modern supply chain management draws parallels to German logistics failure in the Ardennes. Planning backward from available resources rather than forward from mission requirements guarantees failure, whether you're moving armor through Belgium or distributing pharmaceuticals globally. Assuming best-case scenarios rather than building in redundancy creates brittleness that collapses under stress. The Wehrmacht's calculation that they could sustain operations for 5 days on resources adequate for 3 days mirrors corporate failures, where optimistic projections mask resource inadequacy. The context differs, but the mathematical reality remains constant. Operations require sustainable resource flows, and hoping for best-case consumption doesn't make it reality. The war crimes prosecution legacy extends into contemporary international law. The command responsibility doctrine established through the Malmedy trial continues evolving through international criminal court jurisprudence. Modern military lawyers study Knittel's case when teaching commanders about their obligations regarding subordinate actions. The legal standard has shifted. Ignorance is no longer defense if a commander should have known about crimes. Active investigation is required, not passive acceptance of implausible denials. These principles trace lineage directly to post-war trials where German officers claimed they simply didn't know what their men were doing. International law responded, "Commanders have obligations to know, to prevent, to punish." Knittel's prosecution helped establish those standards. The civilian casualties at Stavelot illuminate ongoing debates about warfare in populated areas. Modern urban combat from Fallujah to Mosul to Mariupol produces civilian death tolls that echo Belgian experiences in 1944. The tactical problems remain unchanged, distinguishing combatants from non-combatants, providing safe evacuation routes, balancing military necessity against civilian protection. Technology has improved precision, but precision means nothing when combat occurs in buildings where families shelter. The Stavelot Memorial lists 130 names of civilians killed when their town became a battlefield. Those names ask uncomfortable questions about whether modern militaries have truly learned how to fight in cities without destroying the people they're ostensibly liberating. The human dimension of Kampfgruppe Knittel's story resists reduction to lessons and principles. These were men, individual human beings with families, hopes, fears, moral capacities. Some made terrible choices. Some made necessary choices in impossible circumstances. Some were victimized by strategic delusions they didn't create. Reducing them to case studies risks losing their humanity in service of pedagogical convenience. The soldier who executed civilians at Stavelot was also the son who wrote loving letters home. The commander who ignored atrocities at Malmedy was also the officer who risked his life to save encircled troops at Corson. Human complexity doesn't excuse crimes, but acknowledging complexity honors truth over comfortable simplification. The strategic futility question haunts any examination of the Ardennes Offensive. What if Germany had succeeded? What if Knittel had held Stavelot? If fuel had arrived? If American lines had broken? The counterfactual analysis is devastating. Even perfect execution would have achieved nothing strategically significant. Reaching the Meuse wouldn't have prevented Allied victory, wouldn't have caused Britain and America to negotiate, wouldn't have saved the Third Reich. The entire offensive was theater, desperate actions chosen because doing nothing felt like admission of defeat. Thousands of German soldiers died, hundreds of Allied soldiers died, hundreds of Belgian civilians died, for an operation that couldn't change the war's outcome under any realistic scenario. That's the darkest lesson. Societies sometimes sacrifice their young in futile gestures when leaders lack courage to admit defeat. Contemporary relevance extends beyond military planning to questions of institutional culture and moral responsibility. How do professional organizations maintain ethical standards under extreme stress? How do individuals resist institutional pressures to normalize atrocity? The SS wasn't created as criminal organization, but evolved into one through incremental moral compromises. Reconnaissance troops didn't begin their careers intending to ignore massacres, but Eastern Front experience gradually degraded moral sensitivities until war crimes became operational inconveniences rather than crimes demanding intervention. Modern militaries, corporations, governments all face similar risks, institutional cultures that gradually shift ethical boundaries until the unthinkable becomes routine. Kampfgruppe Knittel's story is warning about that incremental moral corrosion. The memory question remains contentious. How should democracies remember soldiers who fought skillfully for evil causes? Can tactical competence be acknowledged without celebrating service to Nazism? These questions lack simple answers because they involve tension between historical accuracy and moral judgment. Knittel was skilled commander. That's factually true. He also served a genocidal regime and made choices that facilitated war crimes. Also factually true. Mature historical understanding requires holding both truths simultaneously, neither excusing crimes through admiration for skill, nor denying skill to emphasize criminality. The challenge is maintaining that balance against cultural pressures to simplify into heroism or villainy. Walking today through Stavelot's narrow streets, past the bridge that has been rebuilt, through the cemetery where Belgian civilians and German soldiers are buried in different sections, the past feels simultaneously distant and immediate. 80 years separates us from December 1944. But the moral questions Kampfgruppe Knittel's story raises about duty and obedience, competence and criminality, individual choice and institutional pressure remain urgently contemporary. We study their story not to condemn the dead, though some deserve condemnation. We study to understand how ordinary people became participants in extraordinary evil, how tactical proficiency served strategic madness, how bravery and criminality coexisted in same individuals. The lessons aren't comfortable. Truth rarely is. The ultimate question Kampfgruppe Knittel's story poses is this: what do we owe the dead? We owe them accurate memory, neither demonized nor sanitized. We owe them honest accounting of their choices, neither excused by circumstance nor judged without understanding pressure they faced. We owe them the recognition that they were human, capable of courage and crime, loyalty and cruelty, often simultaneously. And we owe them the commitment to learn from their experience, to understand how states convince young men that dying for impossible objectives serves higher purpose, how institutions normalize atrocity, how tactical excellence becomes divorced from strategic reality. These lessons, purchased in Belgian blood and German desperation, remain relevant wherever humans organize violence in service of political aims. The bridge at Stavelot stands as monument to all these contradictions. It was worth hundreds of lives to capture in December 1944. It was retaken or destroyed days later, making those deaths meaningless strategically. It was rebuilt and now serves peacetime traffic, connecting communities rather than dividing armies. The stones remember nothing. We must remember for them, not to refight the battle or relitigate the trials, but to understand how tactical missions divorce from strategic reality, destroy everyone they touch. Kampfgruppe Knittel fought brilliantly. They lost anyway because brilliance cannot overcome mathematical impossibility. They committed crimes along the way because institutional culture had normalized brutality, and they passed into history as cautionary tale about the relationship between tactical competence and strategic wisdom, between individual choice and institutional evil, between courage and consequence. These lessons, purchased in winter snow, with lives that could have been lived for better purposes, remain history's gift to present. Whether we're wise enough to accept that gift remains open question. The bridge endures, the dead await our answer.